This is disc number 7.
As they passed where the bed had stood in the cabin, Carrie bent for a square of paper, old and yellowed, one side a sketch of a woman. It must have fallen from somewhere between the bed slats and tick. Carrie's heart stopped. She knew the face. With no photographs of her, this would be the one surviving likeness of Missy Marie McGregor, a sketch her husband, Johnny Mac, must have done years ago. In the drawing, she stood smiling, still young and unhurt by the world or her own marriage. She clutched a basket of eggs, wildflowers spilling out one side of it. Behind her on the ground scrabbled a couple of chickens and a rooster that must have predated King Lear. Without speaking, Carrie waited until they were back in the barn with the stove stoked. Then she handed the sketch to the twins. They did not need to be told who it was. The drawing between their two heads, the twins fell asleep on a quilt with no mattress or tick underneath. "We'll scrape out more pine straw tomorrow," Carrie was saying, but might have fallen asleep before completing the word. The twins were already snoring. Rima arrived at dawn the next morning and insisted she'd be taking more turns with Johnny Mac's care. "Mrs. Smythe's got a whole army of cooks now. They ain't near as good, so no chance of me losing my place," she winked. "But with Mr. Vanderbilt's family all descending on him like the plague from New York, they'll be eating nothing but highfalutin Frenchified food for the next week. Mr. Vanderbilt, he'd take my biscuits any day over croissants, but it gives me some time to help out around here." She surveyed the barn as if it didn't smell of manure, didn't crunch with straw underneath. "Well now, we'll hang some quilts in the stall here, keep out the worst wind, be right snug and homey. Wood stove, table, chairs, got all we need." "And the fiddle Daddy loved, and the other instruments," Jersey pointed out. Rima kissed him on top of his head. "Goes without saying you brung those." She and Carrie exchanged glances. The weight Carrie felt, caring for her father, overseeing the twins, needing to work night and day, still missing the life that she'd left, had just gotten heavier still with the collapse of the roof and the move to the barn. She felt now like her own chest might cave in with the weight, but Rima's eyes held her steady, helped her breathe. Letting the twins accompany her, since Rima was there to watch Johnny Mac, Carrie and Jersey and Tully half-slid, half-slogged back to Biltmore, just in time for Carrie to change into the black dress and white apron she loathed. Still, the whole house smelled of pine and cinnamon and cloves. Every fireplace on the main level blazed. Sleigh bells echoing from far down the approach road, a team of Clydesdales trotted through the front gates in perfect step, a fine spray of snow from each landing hoof. From the steps of Biltmore, Carrie could make out the sleigh's load, a magnificent Fraser fir. Tully and Jersey and the children of the other estate workers in the house and dairy and forestry crew had been pummeling each other with snowballs at the edge of the esplanade. Now they all stopped to gawk, the twins' heads, Carrie saw with a smile, pitching left at the same angle. What a gift to be young, Carrie thought, to not envy the glittering Biltmore and its acres of rooms, to not worry about how you'll be eating or where you'll be sleeping tomorrow, to just enjoy the moment, the snow, the beauty, the bells. Carrie tried to remember if she'd ever felt young. To her surprise, though, she felt herself smile. Snow did that to her. So did the twins, and the scent of pine. Helped her forget for a few blessed minutes at once. Charles McNamee gestured to Vanderbilt across a line of staff gathered to watch the trees' arrival. "From the Douglas farm, one of the larger single tracts purchased early on." Standing near Vanderbilt, Carrie hadn't planned to speak out loud. "My neighbors." But then both men were looking at her as she watched the approach of the sleigh and its trees. This time she faced them. The Douglases were my neighbors. Hesitating, McNamee edged closer. She's right. I don't recall all the positions of all the farms without checking our records. Naturally, not for tens of thousands of acres, but the earliest and the final ones are more vivid. I do recall the McGregor land abutted the Douglas tract. Abuts, she corrected, smiling so it might not sound rude. Forgive me, Mr. McNamee, but it's still present tense. Still my farm next to the old Douglas place. The two men exchanged glances. Oddly troubled glances, she thought. Vanderbilt broke the silence, shifting his attention toward the sleigh gliding toward them down the long drive, the horses tossing their heads, the three men in the driver's seat all windblown and beaming. Glad Cabot was able to stay longer. Poor fellow, McNamee added. Picturing the palatial home on Louisburg Square in Boston that the American architect had featured, Carrie's head lifted. But there was no time to ask why McNamee would call the owner of such a home a poor fellow. The Clydesdales stomped to a halt in front of the stairs, everyone talking and laughing, the sleigh bells still ringing as the horses shook their heads. The gathered crowd moved forward to help with untying the tree. His cheeks flushed with the cold, John Cabot leapt from in between Marco Bergamini and Robert Bratchett on the driver's seat. In his arms were boughs of evergreen of all sorts, white pine and hemlock and fir. Fumbling, he thrust out a hand to Vanderbilt and then McNamee. Turning to Carrie, he fastened the ends of a balsam bough into a wreath and held it out to her. For the neck of a lion, perhaps? Dropping to his knees in the snow, he circled another bough around the neck of the other marble lion. He leaned back. What do we think, Mrs. Smythe? The housekeeper nodded approvingly. I think, Mr. Cabot, that you, sir, have a proper good eye. With his eyes brighter than Carrie had ever seen on him, he looked up at her. The ridge up there, close to your farm, isn't it? Yours and Tully's and Jersey's? Yes, and... Yes. You remembered their names. They're your family. He stood, seemed about to say something more, but appeared to change his mind, sweeping his arm up toward the ridge. It's spectacular in the snow, the views, the hemlocks and hardwoods, not completely deforested like so many of the acres George bought. Her heart squeezed as she pictured it. Exactly why we could never sell. I'll work my hands clear to the gristle first. She could see his eyes widen and fix on her. Almost, she thought, too fixed, as if determined not to exchange glances with anyone else. I wonder, he ventured, if you'd be willing to show me your farm one day soon. I know it's nearly the Christmas season, and Mrs. Smythe has you working quite late in the evenings, but if you have a few hours off, would you and your brother and sister be willing to show me? He knew a surprising amount of her life. She yanked another long strand of twine loose from the Fraser fir where it was bound to the sleigh, then raised an eyebrow at him. So you can explore more of the oddities of hillbilly ways, Mr. Cabot? Ah, fair enough. The shock of hair flopped onto his forehead as he smiled. I won't pretend to understand these mountains as you do, but I will tell you that I find myself drawn here in ways I can hardly explain, as if I'd come home. Carrie turned with a loose strand of twine in one hand, and the smile she gave back was genuine. Actually, Mr. Cabot, you did fine just now explainin'. Every available person on the estate, including several workers from the farm and the forestry crew, and the owner of Biltmore himself, bent a back to help drag the giant fir indoors and across the house to the banquet hall. The children of the estate workers bounced and milled about, snatching up twigs of fir, then sticking them behind each other's ears and into frayed collars, all of them squealing. Proper gutted, far too crowded it is with all these, Mrs. Smythe groused, but quietly out of range of the ebullient George Vanderbilt. Doing my head in, that's what. A man smelling of tobacco and burnt sugar shouldered in beside Carrie to grip part of the trunk. Dear, she surprised herself at the stir of being both glad, the habit of years, and deeply uneasy. It's been a while since we've seen each other. I seen you some, from a distance, when you didn't rightly see me. Actually, I saw you from a distance once, too, when I was walking through Asheville. There was the most awful broadside on a lamp-post at the corner. Even as they both sidestepped along with the Fraser fir, he gave her a look full of flint and powder. Then, strangely, his gaze swung to Marco Bergamini, and back. Had Dirk seen them walking together from Riverside Cemetery and made some sort of assumptions? At the hall's end opposite the three fireplaces, Dirk and Robert Bratchett clambered up wooden ladders propped high against the far wall. From below, the Italian tossed them each one end of a long rope, whose middle was looped around the top of the fir. As a group of men below lifted and positioned its trunk into a tin bucket of water, the men on the ladders leveraged the tree's top until it stood straight. Forming a half-circle below, the children clapped, their heads resting on their backs, as they gaped up at the giant fir. It was Tully who began to sing, her voice clean and pure as the winter air, the others joining in. Oh, Christmas tree! Oh, Christmas tree! Close to where Carrie stood, Bratchett directed securing the tree. Grown, spun, and twined it myself, this rope. Soaked that sapling for months before cutting the strips. Tie that one higher. Dirk scowled. Reckon I can judge my own self what'll hold good, he barked from the ladder. The children singing faltered. A little higher, Bratchett pointed. Good. Now at least 3 more. But not so many they show up from below. That's right. Tie the ends near the organ up there. That should hold. Buono. Marco Bergamini stepped back to survey their work. Sembra buono. Dirk dropped from a fourth of the way down the ladder to land beside him. How about you speak English, Geppetto? Silence rippled over the room now until all was quiet. Dirk stood braced, head lowered slightly, like a bull ready to charge. Had just about enough of your kind. Spittle spewed from his lips, and he wiped his mouth with his shirt sleeves. Raising an eyebrow, the Italian said nothing. You people come here, getting paid more to cut stone than I do to break my back digging dirt. I have only just come, Bergamini put in, but Dirk wasn't listening. It was as if, Carrie thought, some invisible hand were moving Dirk's mouth like a puppet's, some other force slowing his movements, slurring his words. You come here with all your diseases, and you sneak around scaring good law-abiding citizens. Don't think I don't know what you're after. McNamee cleared his throat. Mr. Tate, is it? Perhaps a short break. Carrie slipped forward to place a hand on Dirk's shoulder. Hey, what's gotten into you? As if her hand were tongs just out of one of the fires at the opposite end of the room, he jerked away. Don't be thinking people can't see what the hell's going on. George Vanderbilt stepped into his path. Mr. Tate, I believe it's time you left. Now. Scowling, Dirk stomped toward the main hall. Out through the kitchen courtyard with you, Miff, Mrs. Smythe called after him. I won't be having the servants tracking more mud out where Mr. Vanderbilt's guests come and go. Dirk whirled, fists clenched as the crowd hobbled closer to the tree. A child whimpered, edging closer to his dairyman father. Dirk's steps reverberated through the banquet hall as he stormed out through the back corner door toward the kitchens below. For several beats after the echoes of his footsteps faded, nobody spoke. Tilting his head back to see the tree's very top, Vanderbilt spoke pointedly in Italian. Buono, sembra buono. Not just good, but excellent. And now, Mrs. Smythe, if you could bring some of that mulled cider for everyone as we decorate Biltmore's first Tree. Mrs. Smythe reappeared from the breakfast room, an enormous sterling tray in her arms, the air of the banquet hall filling with cinnamon and cloves, brown sugar and apple, on top of the scents of glowing maple wood in the 3 fireplaces and the Fraser fir. From below came a crash, as if a whole line of copper pans had been knocked to the floor. Dig, Carrie knew, making his way out through the kitchen courtyard, with something vicious and raging inside him. Chapter 30. Christmas Eve, 1895. Sliding from the long-legged chestnut Mrs. Smythe had insisted that Carrie use for this errand in town, Carrie led the horse by the reins toward the train station. She wasn't much of a horsewoman. Their mule Malvolio was fully as stubborn as the cliché about his sort would suggest, requiring maximum effort just to make him walk. But this gelding seemed willing enough to comply with whatever she asked, and glad just to be out in the winter air, as she was. She tied him to a white pine in a pool of full sun. Being here at the station again made it all replay in her head. Like one of Mr. Edison's sprocket movies, the pictures rolled in jerks and flashes, but she could see it all. The crushed, bone-set plant where the rail dog had landed, the reporter's tool-steel body, his phylacteries, small black boxes to aid with prayer, there in the mud, and before that, his turning around in his seat on the train to speak with her. His face so alive with purpose and courage when he spoke of newspapers and democracy. Kicking snow in front of her, Carrie slowed as she approached the Western Union window. The telegrapher, Farnsworth, was probably more likely than anyone to know who was where in Best, Biltmore Junction, sitting as he did in the busiest part of the village and listening more than he talked. Today, in the few minutes she had before Mrs. Smythe's order was ready, Carrie needed to find Dearg. Word on the ridge was he and his brother had moved off their farm now for good. As she kicked at the snow, she thought again of what she'd spotted that night on the ground. The phylacteries, symbols of the reporter's faith and background, little black boxes that had gone. Where? Did the police have them now? Carrie reached the window. Mr. Farnsworth. The metal arm of the machine on his desk was tapping out a message. Round glasses sliding low on his nose, he glanced up without raising his head, as if to remind her how busy he was. I wonder if you might know where I could find Dearg Tate. Farnsworth kept his eyes on the metal arm. Do I look like I'm paid enough to answer inane questions? As part of your job, probably not. But I was asking you as a part of this village. Village is going to hell if you ask me. That help? Besides Farnsworth was the framed crest on the desk Carrie had spotted earlier. Now, though, she looked more closely. In its swirl of embellishments was a fleur-de-lis and, inside its central shield, a silhouette that looked like her own King Lear posing above the hens at the break of dawn. A rooster. A Gallic rooster? It was only a guess, an impulse, a flash of recalling the fleur-de-lis in the issue of the Atlantic Monthly that depicted symbols of national pride, including of France. But she'd said it aloud before it occurred to her that caution might be in order in dealing with Farnsworth. The telegrapher lifted his head, narrowed his eyes. Edward Farnsworth, she continued, not exactly a French name. Farnsworth's lips did not part, but one half of his mouth lifted in almost a smile, like a chess master finally finding a worthy opponent. So the Ligue Nationale Antisémitique. An unlit cigarette dangled from his lips, just like on the night of the attack. What the hell is it you're trying to ask? On the night of the murder here, you disappeared too, just before the Jewish reporter, was killed. Farnsworth lifted an eyebrow at her, as if daring her to go on. Carrie's insides clenched. From a few feet away, the station master strode over and shook his head at the telegraph operator. "Farnsworth been a real ass lately, more than usual even." The telegrapher pressed his thin lips into a line and held Carrie's gaze. She could see nothing there, not guilt, not an attempt at denial, only, what was it? A kind of pride, a viciousness maybe too, and a challenge. "As it happens, Carrie," the station master offered, "I can answer your question. Hadn't seen Dirk myself since he got back from Whitnall. Day after the attack it was that his train come in. But I heard the Tate brothers took up at a boarding house, 48 Spruce, over to Asheville. Lived there myself when I first moved here, which is how I'd know. Keep up some with Mrs. Reynolds, lady that runs it." "That's kind. Thank you." Carrie glanced at the sun. She'd have to ask the chestnut to run if she wanted to cover the 3 miles to Spruce Street from the village, talk briefly with Dirk, if she could find him, pick up the Biltmore order, then get back to the house in the span of time Mrs. Smythe would expect, and also before dark. The thought of the dark and Dirk together made Carrie queasy. But then, so did the thought of standing here with Edward Farnsworth and his crest. Farnsworth. Now new images joined the others still jerking and flashing through her mind. The telegrapher circling behind the station, wrenching the rail dog from its hooks, hauling it high above his head, bringing it down in one vicious arc on the newspaper reporter. "He's here," Mrs. Reynolds pronounced, oddly enough, because he rarely is. She sniffed, sensorial and disapproving. She squinted at Carrie. "You may meet with him in the parlor just here." She gestured to the left, a room crowded with overstuffed chairs and fringed lamps. "Or you may go up to his rooms on the 3rd floor. Dependin'." On what type of woman you are went unsaid, but Carrie heard it clearly. That was the wonderful thing about being from a class of people already suspect. You were free to do as you liked, since no one expected much from you. "I'll just be a few moments, so I'll trot on up." The landlady smirked, but Carrie was already mounting the stairs as fast as her skirts would allow. Dirk opened at the first knock, apparently expecting someone else. At the sight of Carrie, his eyes rounded. With a flicker of fear, Carrie thought, before the defiance set in again. Even as he stepped back to let her inside, saying nothing in the way of greeting, his face had already shut down to defensive, walled off. He motioned to a chair, but remained standing himself. So Carrie did too. "I won't keep you long, Dirk." He crossed his arms over the wide breadth of his chest. "It's good to see you," she began. The truth was, she'd have rather chewed rusty nails than come here to ask what she had to ask. His voice came hoarse, more emotion behind it than he would let show. "Good to see you too." "Dirk, I'm not here to challenge your decision to sell your land. I know as well as anybody how hard it is to hang on, especially now with so few of us left." His face relaxed a bit. Again, he motioned her to a chair, and this time they both sat. Carrie let her eyes roam over the room. Just a small iron-framed bed and wooden dresser, and an army cot in one corner, no doubt for Jeremy, who must be at school. Dirk had brought little with him from his home place, his mother's spinning wheel and churn and loom probably all left for the workmen, who would surely dismantle the cabin now that the land was part of Biltmore. He'd brought 3 guns, though. His great-grandfather's old flintlock hung over the bed, the Winchester stood propped near the door, and a pistol sat on the small table, as if he needed to be ready for some sort of violence that could arrive at his door any moment. Her eyes moved from the door and its rifle back to him. "Ain't a safe world anymore," he said. Was it ever? His face, ruddy and handsome, contorted now, almost as if he wanted to cry. "Things was good before. Not easy, but good. Now look. At you and me, our land, we've been shoved out. And by what? Some rich Yankees think they can hoard half the Blue Ridge, and a pack of foreigners coming here with all their damn crime." "You mean the murder?" He looked away. Not just that. What else? There's all kind of damage they come here to do. The amber of his eyes softened a moment. You need protecting. He reached out a big calloused hand and touched her knee, but then looked quickly away. No, Dig, I don't. I'm just fine. He stared at her for a moment, then clenched his jaw. His eyes that had been warm on her only a moment ago had gone cold, defiant. Look as much doubtful as you want, Carrie McGregor. You'll see. It's liable to not be our own damn country much longer. They're taking over. Who's they? All them who shouldn't come in the first place. Don't belong. The Dagos, the Jews, the Coloreds, all them. Carrie thought of Aunt Rima's advice and counted to 10. Isn't this really more about your feeling pushed out? You wait. Whole damn race will be lost if things keep on like this. What race are we running here? Not running. It's the white race that's fixing to pass. Here. France, Germany, everywhere. There's research, scientific, to prove it. Just a matter of time. Won't be nothing left of us. Lest things get changed. Fast. The white race. Carrie blinked. The image of that telegram Madison Grant received flashing into her mind. Gallic rooster. Part of the crest hanging in Farnsworth's office, and a symbol of French pride. Reichsadler must be a German word, though she'd no idea what it meant. Some symbol of German pride, surely. So the bald eagle must stand for the United States, not some wildlife preservation effort of Grant's. And the cable's last words, the race will be lost if we continue this way. So then, the sender had used race with a double meaning, a competition about to be lost, but also a reference, fearful and frantic, to skin color and nationalism. My God, Dirk, how did Madison Grant and Farnsworth and their sort infect you? He pulled his pocket watch out and set it on his thigh. Carrie felt as if its second hand were throbbing inside the room. Carrie McGregor and her famous noticins, that it? Dig, I know you. His eyes met hers, and for a moment she could see only the old schoolhouse slates, the forget-me-not flower chains, the bare feet in icy spring creeks. You're parroting these things. What you're saying, it's not the boy or the young man I knew. Her eyes swept over his room again, landing this time on the table to her left. She'd noticed only the pistol last time she'd looked, but now she saw the stack of paper beside it, crudely printed with bold type and caricatures. Carrie held up one of the flyers. A man like Madison Grant seems so suave and polished and smart, but he can suck you down in a whole river of trouble, cause a whole ocean of hurt. The look Dirk leveled at her roiled with resentment, anger that radiated from him, and also confusion, Carrie thought, at being left behind in a world changing so fast, so utterly, the ground shifting under his feet while he tries just to stand still. Dig, was it you who vandalized Ling Yong's shop? Rising, he walked to the door, ran a hand over the muzzle of his Winchester, his way of saying he was done talking. Dig, it's Christmas Eve. We've known each other our whole lives. Been damn important to each other, he finished for her, his voice gone hoarse. He opened the door for her, to leave. Merry Christmas, Carrie McGregor, he said. She waited, searching his eyes to see if he really meant her to go like this, shoved out. She squeezed shut her eyes against the sweet images of the past, the barn dances, the stolen kisses beside the falls. When she opened them, he'd pressed his lips hard together in his square jaw, trapping in words he couldn't or wouldn't say. For an instant, his eyes softened again, his hand lifting as if he would touch her face. But the hand dropped. The eyes looked away. Merry Christmas, dear Tate, she whispered. and left. Chapter 31. LeBlanc glowered at the telegrapher, the scrawny little man with a mangy beard on the other side of the glass, and splotchy teeth, LeBlanc saw, like spots of a dog's urine in snow. "You heard me. A cable to New Orleans, and I don't have all day." Waiting by a sleigh near the platform, a groom in full livery was stomping his feet to keep warm. Full livery. Here. Miles past the middle of nowhere. What the hell was that about? The telegrapher appeared not to take well to goading from an outsider. Damn these provincial idiots, this whole sorry excuse for a town. The man sat down with exaggerated slowness at his machine. "You want this telegram to go to, who'd you say in New Orleans?" "Mr. Maurice Barthélemy. Spell that name." LeBlanc sounded out the letters. "Sender's name? Leblanc. A beat of silence. "And you'd like to say, what?" "Followed here from Penn Quarry. Stop. Closing in on Catalfamo. Stop. That's it?" "That's all the hell that's needed. Seeing as how it's Christmas Eve, most of my customers today have added a greeting of the damn season." A snort. "So I can pay extra for the have a hell of a Merry Christmas that I'm having to spend in some God-forsaken mountains hundreds of miles from any form of civilization? I assume that is a no on the greetings of the season, then." The groom or footman, or whatever he was in that ridiculous livery, LeBlanc noticed, looked like he'd walked out of a damn storybook. Hat pulled down over his eyes and collar up high, gold embroidery on a red coat. "Looks like a damn Buckingham Palace guard here in this backwater." The telegrapher looked as if he might take offense, but then shrugged. "George Vanderbilt's got his people all fancied up for tonight. Got a house here, just now getting finished. Whole pack of his family'll be arriving on the next train." He nodded toward a slim man with a neatly trimmed mustache who'd stopped to talk with the guy in livery. "Why, Vanderbilt himself be here." LeBlanc huffed on the muddy edge of the street, his breath coming in puffs of steam. "So, any hotels here fit for a man of taste? Looks to me like nothing but pine trees and snow. Should have gotten off one stop later for Asheville. About 3 miles up is Kenilworth, Battery Park Inn, some others." He pointed to a road leading west. "So now I'm supposed to walk 3 miles in the snow, here to catch a dangerous criminal, and you're telling me I got to walk 3 miles to a decent hotel?" On the other side of his window, which hadn't been cleaned for some time, Farnsworth glanced up indifferently from the metal arm. "Do I look like I'm paid enough to send messages for outsiders showing up here, all rude, and then solve their problems?" LeBlanc took stock of the man. "Fortunately for both of us, I'm paid well enough both to be rude and get the answers I want." Pulling a money clip from the breast pocket of his coat, he peeled off 2 bills, which he shoved through the opening where the glass ended and a narrow wooden shelf began. The telegrapher slid the money into his pocket without comment. "Livery stable's a block that way." He jerked his head east. "If anybody's still there this time of evening, night before Christmas. So what crimes you want it for?" The detective paused for dramatic effect, then pronounced the word slowly, in 2 separate parts, as if he'd rolled both around in his mouth, tasting them. "Murder." The telegrapher narrowed his eyes. "Who's he supposed to have killed?" "Not supposed to have. The victim himself named his killers before he died." "Said the man's very name, did he?" "Identified the killers, let's just say. This was one of them that got away." Farnsworth crossed his arms. "This was what year?" 90, when it happened. 91, when the bastard slipped the grasp of justice. Hold on. You've been chasing this guy for 4, 5 years? about the size of it. Yeah. So this guy's kept you bumbling around for half a decade. LeBlanc clipped his words. Pinkerton detectives do not bumble around. Just surprised you hadn't caught the fellows all. Jackass, the detective muttered as he stalked away. Farnsworth gave 2 taps to the metal arm of his machine. Message received, he called. But now the ground was shaking, the hemlocks shivering branches of snow to the ground. A train's whistle echoed off the mountains and drifted through the valley. By the time LeBlanc returned on a hurriedly rented horse, its saddle blanket rumpled under the pommel, a front hoof pawing at a snowdrift. The train had been unloaded. Through billows of steam, he could make out what appeared to be several brown bears balanced up on 2 feet. The sallow light of a lamppost, though, showed them to be women in head-to-toe furs. Out of curiosity, which was his damn job after all, LeBlanc kicked his nag forward to where he could both see and hear. The oldest of the women was reaching for Vanderbilt's hand. "George, dear, we cannot wait to see your Biltmore in all its glory, son." Vanderbilt kissed her on the cheek. "A bedroom has been designed specifically for you, Mother. How good to have you back." The groom, or whatever he was, had been joined by others unloading trunks and hat boxes from the train into a second and third sleigh, pulled now behind the first. Bundled in their furs and clutching the servants' hands, the Vanderbilts piled into the first 2 sleighs, their towers of trunks being hauled into the third. Another of the women, this one younger, perhaps in her 40s, had been gazing in a full circle about her. "Oh, heavens! How remote a spot, George! How do you bear the isolation from society?" LeBlanc couldn't make out what Vanderbilt murmured to the woman, something boringly bland and polite from the tone. "Still, it's a relief to be out of New York," the woman said. "Really, George, 3/4 of the city now are foreigners. Good God, the goulashes and garlics, the pigs and chickens and hordes of children, half of them reeking of disease. And the smells, a complete dearth of simple hygiene." Letting the servant in the ridiculous livery hand her up into the sleigh, she paused at its running board to address the others. "This mystery home of George's will be a lovely respite, I'm sure, if only for the pure, unpolluted air." The servant's arm must have slipped then, nearly dropping the woman flat into the snow, but he recovered in time to catch her fall. The sleighs loaded, the Vanderbilts and their furs and trunks went jingling off toward a break in the trees and a big hulking arch of an entrance of some sort. "Waste of my damn time watching all that," LeBlanc muttered. He kicked his horse into a trot, snow winging out from each step, heading in the direction the idiot telegrapher had pointed. Chapter 32. It took only the one sentence whispered to her from the doorway, and Carrie's hands went unsteady, which she realized not by a look down at them, but by the sterling flashing in the firelight. Gold and red and green sparked from the edges of the platter that her hands gripped, wobbling. Tully and Jersey had been invited to spend the night at Biltmore tonight in an empty servant's room with Carrie, since she would be working late. Ella Bratchett had offered again to care for Johnny Mack in Carrie's absence. Carrie had held her arm. "Please let me pay you for your time. If mountain folk can't take care of each other, especially with us about the only 2 farms in these parts not already bought up, and you all living here in this barn, then the world's gone clear to hell and took us with it. Please, it's the only way I feel comfortable staying over at Biltmore. We'll talk about it later. I'm just glad Rima finally let on to me about the roof collapsing, so we'd know you could use some help. Y'all go on now." Ignoring the issue of money, Robert Bratchett had shaken his head. "Johnny Mack and me, we got some things we need to get straight with each other. I'll stay with Ella, and we'll have us that talk." Carrie had swallowed hard. then lifted the photo of her father and Bratchett in their Union Army uniforms from where it lay on their one table. This was inside his fiddle. Bratchett raised an eyebrow. Was it now? He made no move to see it closer, as if the image were thoroughly preserved in his memory already. Ella stiffened her shoulders like she was bracing against some strong emotion. Silence followed, swollen and throbbing with things unsaid. Is there nothing either of you can tell me about this picture, or why it stirs him up? She studied her father, who'd not been conscious all day. I mean, besides memories of the war. Robert Bratchett's eyes were on her father's unmoving form. Not everyone here in the mountains fought for that side, you know. We knew he'd been with the Union, but he's never talked much about it ever. No, he wouldn't. Is there anything about the photo that my father would associate with the attack at the station? The odd thing is, she'd hit some sort of chord here, the visitors' eyes finding each other. Ella Bratchett spoke at last. Best let Robert talk with your daddy first, if there's a chance in the coming days. See can they clear up some things. Then, later, you can ask all the questions you like. Now the twins, their faces scrubbed and gleaming, stood peering out of the hall leading to the billiard room. Mrs. Smythe had commanded them to stay well out of the way as the flood of guests arrived. This made Carrie jumpy enough, wondering what the twins might do or say. But it was Marco Bergamini's words to her a moment ago that had given her hands their shake, the tumblers of hot cocoa rattling on the silver. The Clydesdales had been harnessed again tonight to the sleighs, their silver bells jangling through the falling snow as they returned, mounded with brown fur and top hats, blanketed passengers and luggage. The footmen and grooms all occupied with the unloading of people and their towers of possessions, Carrie stood to the side with a platter of hot cocoa in one hand, Pierre steaming croissants in the other. Rima had insisted on adding more cream to the hot cocoa at the last minute, igniting a battle downstairs. Because, Rima had triumphed in a final shot, with all the jawing over Mr. Vanderbilt's prize dairy Jersey cows, the cream ought to get its own say. Chuckling to herself, Carrie held out the platter to guests. There is trouble, Marco whispered as he staggered by with the trunk toward the freight elevator. Oh? She'd turned, nearly sloshing hot cocoa onto George Vanderbilt, who'd leapt from the first sleigh as it jingled and shushed to a standstill. On the next pass with the trunk, Marco added, I have the confession to make, which was all they'd had time to exchange, but his eyes had gone tight and dark. Carrie's heartbeat throbbed in her throat. If it was a confession of the reporter's murder, she'd rather roll buck naked and lie than hear it. For all that was murky about the two Italians and their past, she trusted them now and didn't want to have that changed for her. A few feet away, John Cabot helped greet the guests. I'll stay only to say hello, he told Vanderbilt. You're welcome as long as you'd like to stay. I won't have you cooped up all alone on Christmas at Battery Park. I'll give my greetings to your mother and briefly to the others, but this is a family gathering. He clapped Vanderbilt on the shoulder. And I'll have a stunning view of the mountains and snow from my window. Come back at least then in the afternoon tomorrow for the presentation of gifts to the children of the staff, won't you? The bashfulness was back in Vanderbilt's eyes. I expect it to be something you'd especially enjoy. All right then, and thank you. Cabot's gaze slid to Carrie, then away. Having returned her tray of empty tumblers to the electric dumbwaiter and sent it below to the kitchens, Carrie pulled a tray of steaming wassail in the V-monogrammed cups from the manual version along the opposite wall. Tully and Jersey were darting like minnows, Mrs. Smythe sending them up and downstairs between the kitchens and butler's pantry like a third, far noisier food transport system. Did you see all them furs, Carrie? Did ya? Tully demanded. It's a wonder there's a fox left in the world. I don't think those were fox, Tulls. All I could do not to run up and pet 'em. Carrie grimaced, laughing. Let's be real sure you don't. Jersey dodged out of her way as she turned with a tray of wassail. The man Cabot, the one with the sad he wears in the eyes, how come he's still here when all the rest of the friends up and left a couple weeks back? Not sure, except that not everybody has family. As if imagining such a thing, Jersey's eyes filled. Maybe she'd done too good a job at stressing compassion to the twins. Both their hearts were maybe more tender than was safe in this world. As Carrie looked for a footman to take the tray from her, Mrs. Smythe swept by. Mr. Vanderbilt assures me he cares not a whit if it's a footman or a maid who serves, but I can hardly bear it myself. She shook her head ruefully. Still, we're 2 footmen short, and that mud monster downstairs broke out of the basement. It's back past the pantry. We've got him caught, is our Cedric. Chaos, that's what Americans thrive on, she sighed. I'll be sending you out, Carrie, where, God help us, there ought not be a kitchen maid. Carrie stepped carefully down into the sunken level of the winter garden, its palms nodding in the currents created by milling guests. The air smelled of cloves and cinnamon and apples again, the wassail she carried, and also of the orchids that ringed the fountain. The guests were gazing up and around, peppering Vanderbilt with questions. Do show us where you chose to hang the John Singer Sargent of Mother. A wonder, George, that you found skilled workers this far from civilization. You said not all were imported from England, so even to fill a competent staff, the fact that all of them appear even to have recently bathed. Carrie jolted to a halt there, the tray lurching sideways as she spun, but a hand slipped under her tray, caught it just in time. John Cabot was looking at her, holding her gaze. Steady on, he murmured. Carrie pulled her spine straighter. Thank you. She dipped to her left to offer the wassail to Vanderbilt's eldest brother, whose face was upturned, assessing the glass dome overhead. Hunt has outdone himself once again. I don't want to know how much of your inheritance you spent, George. I'm still astonished that you chose a spot so remote that you had to construct a spur of railroad to it, and so close to a local populace who, let us just say— Actually, Frederick, Vanderbilt interjected, I found the local populace refreshing, their warmth and self-reliance, their shape-note singing in the chapels here, the banjos and fiddles they craft themselves, their humor. Cabot raised his cup of wassail. Their keen intelligence, too. All eyes turned to Cabot, and for a moment he froze, hand in the air. The right tip of Vanderbilt's mustache quirked up in a half-smile. Cabot has been researching the southern Appalachians. The manager of the Battery Park Inn tells me he's pounded away at his Remington at such unseemly hours. The guests on either side and beneath his room have complained of the racket. I'm no kind of pleasant hotel guest, Cabot conceded. Thank goodness Biltmore's guest rooms have been finished before I'm tossed out in the snow. Emily Sloane, whose immediate family appeared to be flanking her now, spoke up. Did George tell you about the murder we've had here? It's been quite the game solving it. One of Vanderbilt's sisters crinkled her nose. Heavens, I'd completely forgotten. We read about it in the papers. Covered because of George and Biltmore, of course. That poor Berkowitz fellow. Even if he was a Jew, I'm not convinced that's a reason to be murdered. I'm fairly certain, Cabot murmured to his cup, it is not. I understand, Frederick Vanderbilt offered, that the fellow may have been sent by the Times to poke into some labor disputes. Another Vanderbilt brother looked alarmed. Good God, I thought we had our people on that, those labor disputes. Frederick Vanderbilt shook his head. Calm yourself, Willie. Not rail or steel. This was something to do with New Orleans, an old story the Times decided had never been fully told. Sent the Berkowitz fellow down to learn more. You know those newspaper types, their unnatural love for buried secrets and melodrama. But why on earth here? Emily Sloane's mother asked. Outside the realms of civilization. She glanced about as if searching for knuckle-dragging men bearing clubs. John Cabot's eyes flashed to Carrie's and quickly away. Something, Carrie thought, he knows or suspects. Something he's not told anyone. Frederick Vanderbilt raised his glass now. The issue we've not broached yet, quite aside from the admitted beauty of the Blue Ridge, is what George has provided for the populace here. A rising tide raises all ships, and the very existence of Biltmore will open opportunities for the benighted locals in their pitiable hovels. Benighted? Carrie blurted before she could clamp down on her own tongue. Pitiable hovels? Arms froze in mid-lift of wassail to lips. All eyes turned to Carrie. Really, George, Emily's mother said, not bothering to lower her voice. Surely you're going to reprimand your maid for that outburst. Actually, I believe, Frederick, George Vanderbilt said without flinching, if you were to find the time to stay at Biltmore longer, you'd see what I do. A landscape of beauty and of populace with great talent and skills, the latter often passed down for generations. Frederick grunted rather than answered, his eyes passing over Carrie. I'd love to hear, Cabot, what you found of value in your research here. John Cabot forced a laugh. Be warned, I have a great deal to say on the ways these mountains and their people have surprised and impressed me. His eyes flicked to Carrie's. She kept her chin high and looked straight ahead. I, for one, said one of the sisters as their host led them toward the banquet hall, would like to hear more of this grisly, apparently unsolvable murder. At those words, Carrie skirted a palm with her tray of empty cups to find Mirko Bergamini huddled, nearly hidden, just behind the door of the billiard room, waiting, it appeared, for her. To confess something, she guessed, that she'd rather not hear. Dread clenching her stomach, Carrie gestured for him to follow as she hurried back toward the dumbwaiters. With those words, murder and confession, still echoing in her head. Chapter 33. Trying to breathe, trying not to be seen, Sal watched from the door of the pantry where Carrie McGregor was unloading the dumbwaiters. A roast turkey, sprigged all over with rosemary, hulked there in the platter's butter and sage. But his need to tell someone the truth had taken any appetite he might have had. At least LeBlanc had not recognized him at the station. Sal had loathed the livery uniform when the new butler Harvey informed the stable hands they'd have to wear it while Mr. Vanderbilt's family was visiting. But the low-sitting hat and high collar and gloves and work that kept him turned with his back to LeBlanc had been a gift. LeBlanc, the bastard. Only he could have shown up on Christmas Eve. 4 years of searching for Sal had only made the man's jowls hang lower, the point of his beard sharper. Carrie tipped her head back toward him. I'm so sorry I can't stop to listen at the moment. 7 courses and clean up from now. I can come find you. Or if you want to stick close by, there may be a minute here or there. As the door swung open and closed from the servants' entrance at the back of the banquet hall, Sal glimpsed the family, these Vanderbilts and Sloanes and Shepherds and Barkers and Kissams, all glittering and gilded in silks and jewels, all gathered around the banquet hall's table. 30 or 40 of them it looked to be. Behind Sal, Nico huddled in the corner watching his brother with those big eyes and sipping the cocoa Mrs. Smythe had given him. I trust you, the eyes said. Mi fido de ti. But that trust had not always served them well in the past. Sal made himself breathe in and out, the butter and sage and rosemary, the fresh-cut greenery from the 3 giant mantles, the Fraser fur they'd hauled in on the sleigh. and the smell of wet, muddy dog from Cedric, poised hopefully, big furry head cocked, at a dog gate blocking off the next room. Moncrief teetered by with compotes of apricot preserves. "It's me legs would be wailin' like bagpipes if they could blow through the knees." On the floor, Nico jumped as the dumbwaiter opened to show something red and white with great grasping claws. "Lobster," Carrie told him. "It's more butter than meat, but rich people convince each other they love it." In time with a string quartet at one end of the hall, Christmas Eve dinner passed course to course. Sal looked for his chance to catch Carrie alone. He could slip away without any confession, but he wanted someone to know. The footmen serving had their own kind of dance, rhythmic and graceful, a floating walk with no bounce or jostle to it, the dip at the left shoulder of a guest, the three-quarter spin away. The musicians at one end of the hall slid from tune to tune. Coventry Carol and I Saw Three Ships and The Holly and the Ivy, with the clatter of silver on china providing percussion. Sal's heart, though, thudded heavily in his chest. He and Nico wouldn't have long to get a jump on LeBlanc. Since he'd only just come to town, and all would be quiet tonight and on Christmas Day, they'd surely have at least a day and a half to plan, and then disappear. But they also needed help knowing where they could go in these mountains, which was part of telling Carrie McGregor the truth, hearing what she had to say. Like the trained poodles in black vests that Sal had once seen in a street show in Florence, the footmen bent at the same moment to refill the wine, a different one for each course it looked like, then straightened and circled in a synchronized line. Sal found himself mesmerized by the light, the platter's filigreed edges catching the glow of the candelabras, of the 3 chandeliers and the 3 roaring fires, of the diamonds and emeralds and sapphires on necks and earlobes and waists. He'd seen rich tourists from all over the world come and go from the pensioni in Florence, but nothing like this. The branches of the Christmas tree had been weighted with garlands and hothouse flowers, velvet boughs, and gilt packages. At its base, more packages mounded, hundreds of them, together with a painted wooden rocking horse and a white wicker doll carriage, an army of toy soldiers and a doll whose curls spilled from a green bonnet, gloved hands clutching a parasol. Sal tried not to think of his mother's face, silver strands of hair spilling back on a ragged green pallet, the stuccoed wall behind her crumbling onto the floor. Shaking his head to rid himself of the image, Sal turned. Perhaps he and Nico should leave, even before the confession. Before hearing where a native like Carrie McGregor might recommend hiding for outsiders who knew nothing about this valley or the blue range that cradled it, assuming she was willing to help. The footmen swirled through the butler's pantry as Carrie loaded their platters again. Sal's mind spun over a host of possible hiding places in the village, none of them good. "Our name," he said casually from a few yards away. Carrie and the footman, waiting for a porcelain tureen of soup, both looked up. "Bergamini. Our name. I hope that you will remember our name. If a question is ever asked of yourself, if you ever must wonder." Carrie's head cocked. It made no sense, this strange comment of his, Sal could see. But Carrie McGregor recalled things, mulled over them later. Sal would wait for a chance to say more, but meanwhile he'd drop a hand on Nico's shoulder to let his brother know everything was all right, which it wasn't. All too soon, Nico would have to know they were hiding again. "Terrapin soup," Carrie said over her shoulder, "and then after that, or maybe after the salmon course, or the saddle of mutton, or the chaud froid, or the quail course, or maybe after the coffee and mocha biscuits and cognac. Dear Jesus, maybe then I'll have 30 seconds to listen. I do want to." He could tell she did not, that she dreaded what she might hear. but she'd said it, which was kind. And that kindness was why he'd risked their coming tonight, Nico and him. That kindness might be all that stood against his being separated from Nico again. With the back of one arm, she pushed hair from her face. "I'm sorry, it's so..." Suddenly, a racket in the main hall brought the cello and violins to a faltering halt. A man was charging through the front door past a frantic Mrs. Smythe. His black topcoat dusted in snow, he turned up its collar to cover the lower half of his face. His eyebrows worked furiously as he glowered over his shoulder to the housekeeper chasing him. Both hands raised to her shoulders, her mouth was an O of horror at the disturbance. For a moment, Sal was fixed to his spot behind the crack in the door. His breath stopped. "I won't keep Mr. Vanderbilt, but a few minutes is all." Stepping around Mrs. Smythe, who'd thrown herself in his path, LeBlanc raised his elbows like spikes on chariot wheels to keep her at a distance. "But on Christmas Eve, of all the things..." "Exactly. I've spent enough damn time following leads that came to nothing. This time, I'll not wait for anyone else's convenience. I'll have my man." From his place in the middle of guests at the banquet table, sitting indignantly quiet, George Vanderbilt rose. "This is rather irregular, surely." Mrs. Smythe's cheeks blazed. "I'd have sent the divvy down the banks but he wouldn't be stopped." The man in the topcoat flashed a badge. "Pinkerton Detective Agency. Perhaps you've heard of us." The smirk on the intruder's face said he knew the answer to this, that the Pinkertons were the stuff of legend now. Detectives who'd tracked assassins and bank robbers, who'd quelled strikes and intimidated workers. Investigators who always found what their clients were searching for. Name's LeBlanc, hired by a prominent family from New Orleans to track down a killer. Sal did not stay to see Carrie McGregor half-turn at the words New Orleans toward where he stood, but she seemed to miss little. He had no doubt she remembered his mention that day at the cemetery of where he'd once lived. She would already be piecing together his changing his name and his words to her tonight. "I have the confession to make, along with more of a picture." A picture that now included, he knew, the word killer, coupled with his own face. Chapter 34. Carrie saw the crack in the door behind her close shut, just as the string quartet at the far end of the banquet hall slid into silent night. She knew without fully turning her head that little Nico would no longer be in the corner, that the Italians had run. Head cocking toward the departing footsteps, Cedric whined and lifted one muddy paw as if to ask a question. "Pinkerton!" The word buzzed over the table. "The nerve of the man! You know the Pinkertons stopped Jesse James." "Yes, and we've used them ourselves. Sniff out the source of a strike better than any bloodhound." "Why on earth," George Vanderbilt asked, "would a Pinkerton man be hunting someone here at Biltmore?" Carrie did not miss the faces of at least two of the men at Vanderbilt's table, the flicker of fear, the defensive pushing back from the table. Perhaps that was the nature of the business world these men lived in, vicious, omnivorous, a stab that could come from behind any cloak. Carrie forced herself to stare directly ahead. The intruder, whose face looked like one of the snarling giants from the twins' fairy tale book, stalked forward. "I'll keep it short, seeing as how you got family here." "Another thought would be," Vanderbilt suggested mildly, "that you come back in 2 days, after Christmas, and tell me everything at your leisure." The Pinkerton man ignored this. "I got my orders to bring in a man I've been tracking for years. Got reason to think he's not only here in these mountains somewhere, but more specifically," he reared back to deliver this last, "here." Ferociously, the man swung his head first left and then right, as if demonstrating the kind of predator search he was capable of. Another rumble of comments from the guests rolled over the table. As Carrie watched from the crack in the door, most of the family appeared more amused than concerned, as if he were providing some needed entertainment in the midst of their meal. Only the two men who'd looked so alarmed at the flash of his badge continued to pull at their collars as if breathing had become suddenly a chore. Behind her, Cedric leaned harder against his gate. Another whine, another muddy paw lifted. A plea. "Be patient," Carrie whispered. "There'll be scraps." "LeBlanc," the housekeeper supplied for her employer. "The bloke's name is Tom LeBlanc. That much I heard before he barreled quite by me, bothering a family on Christmas Eve. I said to myself, says I, what's bloomin' next?" Vanderbilt held up his hand. "We do not blame you, Mrs. Smythe. Mr. LeBlanc, I believe I understand your sense of urgency to be done and return home to—" "New Orleans," LeBlanc thundered. "High time I got back. But first, I got me a slippery dago to catch. Name of Sal Catalfamo." Checking behind her and hoping the twins hadn't heard, Carrie glimpsed Tully's expression at the far door of the butler's pantry, Jersey's right below that. 2 identical slivers of wide-eyed confusion at the demand and the unfamiliar name. Turning back, Carrie saw on George Vanderbilt's face a flash of something, the twitch of a brow, a flint strike of the eye, but then it was gone. Vanderbilt lifted his glass of wine as the string quartet swept into "God Rest You Merry Gentlemen." "And the hunt for this man really needs to be conducted on Christmas Eve? Surely, Mr. LeBlanc, Christmas Eve in 4 damn years up till now," the man bellowed. The string quartet stuttered to a stop, the viola's bow screeching on its strings. "The ladies, Mr. LeBlanc, your language. What merited 4 years?" LeBlanc paused, letting the moment build. In the silence, only the crackle and sigh of the 3 fires sounded. LeBlanc lowered his voice so that the long table of diners had to lean toward him. "I'll tell you then, shall I?" The hiss and spit of the logs, the guests with their jewels winking, their eyes wide on the detective. "Right then. I'm tracking the dago for the murder in 1890 of the police chief of New Orleans. There's been sightings around here of a man who sounds a hell of a lot like Catalfamo. I'll be searching your house and your stables." He swept a burly arm. "I've also had a report from a reliable source with knowledge of this estate that there's reason to connect Catalfamo with your murder here back in October." Afterward, Carrie was not sure if she met George Vanderbilt's eye or just imagined she did. She did know, in that sliver of second, that she'd made a decision. "Cedric," she whispered as she lifted the gate, "it's dinner." A scream from George's sisters brought everyone to their feet as the St. Bernard bounded into the room, mud flying as he paused to shake his thick coat. Wine glasses pitched forward and sterling clanked as the big dog spun to find his master. Ecstatic, Cedric leapt to his master's side and lifted 2 filthy front paws to the table. It might have been the result of the jolt of the dog's body, or the footman who'd bent with the tureen being suddenly flustered, but terrapin soup flew over the guests at George Vanderbilt's left, soaking the bodice of one, spattering the diamond tiara of another, and sloshing the tuxedo front of Frederick Vanderbilt, turning his torso a deep, gelatinous green. The man, Carrie thought with satisfaction, who'd made the pitiable hovels comment. George's mother was calling for everyone to sit down. Stipples, if not entire swaths of green, had found their way onto at least a half-dozen diners. LeBlanc, disgusted, yanked out a watch from his waistcoat pocket and scowled at its face. Vanderbilt surveyed the chaos of his family, wiping at jeweled stomachers and tailed jackets, several of them stalking away from the table. I will, of course, have everything thoroughly cleaned, and what cannot be cleaned, replaced. Apoplectic, Mrs. Smythe appeared in the butler's pantry. They said below it was that beast of a creature whose— Dear Lord, it's worse than disaster, is this? She waved to the nearest footman. Go, Ed, lad. Now. Get the four-legged fur bag downstairs and locked up. All that clobber he's ruined. Stepping into the banquet hall, Carrie cleared her throat. As always, she'd acted on impulse. In this case, to give Bergamini more time. But what if that meant the twins would go hungry now, because she'd be fired? I'm so sorry, Mr. Vanderbilt. It's my— But Vanderbilt held up his hand. It's my fault, actually, for not properly training my dog. In the glance that snapped between them, Carrie caught the hint of a smile. He faced LeBlanc. And you, sir, I can tell you we employed literally hundreds of men from Italy up until a few months ago. They laid the limestone for Biltmore, scored and carved it. I did not, needless to say, know all their names. Since then, most or all of them have returned to their own country. What I can assure you is that there is no one currently employed on my estate by that name. LeBlanc let his scowl singe the length of the table. Murder. In New Orleans. And maybe also the one here. So I'll just be searching your house and stables. The guests looked up from their dripping jewels, their ruined gowns and tails. From the far end of the table, a hesitant voice, hardly more than a whimper. Uncle George? About the Italian. Emily Sloane was swaying slightly, her face a ghastly white. Yes? That one Italian stablehand of yours, is that who Mr. LeBlanc might mean? Carrie watched in horror. Emily Vanderbilt Sloane, who'd been here in the autumn when Marco Bergamini was hired, who would have known not only that he was here, but also that he'd been connected, at least in some minds, with the death at the station. And now, Emily Vanderbilt Sloane, standing straight in her diamonds and turtle soup spattered silk, was about to confirm for LeBlanc that he'd come to the right place. Chapter 35. With Nico on his back, Sal bolted through the stable courtyard, lit only by a single lantern on either side of the main doors and the glow of a fresh dusting of snow. He'd counted on the bricks still being clear after he'd shoveled and swept late this afternoon. But now, every step marked their path from the main house. Sal's feet fought for traction over the slick of the bricks. Nico wrapped both arms around his brother's neck as if their lives depended on his holding fast, which they did. No time now to fret over the tracks. No time to ask the best place to hide. No time to tell anyone why they had every reason to run. He'd thought confessing to Carrie McGregor could be protection if he and Nico got caught again in a maelstrom of blame. One person, at least, who would stick by them. But now he was cursing himself for not guessing that LeBlanc would ram his way into a private estate, without permission, on Christmas Eve. Stupido, così dannatamente stupido. How could he have been so damn stupid? Slipping and sliding and cursing himself as he ran, Sal carried Nico through the stables and out the far double doors toward the woods. With no clear idea where they were going, Sal wanted only right now to put distance between himself and LeBlanc. Nico's survival depended on Sal's. Crashing through the thickest parts of the forest, Sal was banking on LeBlanc, trying to track him on horseback. The more mountain laurels you wind through, the more frozen streams, the more blackberry brambles, the better. Snow dropped from pine branches as they ran. Nico clung tighter to Sal's neck, impeding his breath. Sal would have to think quickly of a place they could hide that wasn't too far away. Running through ice and snow alone would have been taxing, but with an 8-year-old boy on his back, Sal was already winded, and they were still within sight of Biltmore's spires. Nico pressed a frigid cheek against Sal's neck, and the message was clear. Trust. That Sal would keep them safe and unhurt. That in this next place, they'd no longer have to use phony names and fear strangers and wonder who might want the foreigners gone and do whatever it took to drive them away. Trust, Sal thought with anguish, that had not been earned. Lungs burning, Sal gripped his little brother's legs harder at both sides and ran on. Chapter 36. Carrie stared at Emily Sloane, prayed she would suddenly lose her voice or keel over with a sudden palsy. Anything to keep her from speaking. The girl stood before the detective.
The one Italian in my Uncle George's employ was in the stables, Mr. LeBlanc, but he left yesterday. I saw him myself. Headed, I heard him say, for the train station, to leave town, though I obviously didn't follow the man to see him safely on. She laughed then, as easily as if she'd been raised on the stage. Her laugh let the detective see how much her word could be trusted. A young heiress who could not possibly have any motive to lie. Carrie turned to find the twins creeping forward. She put a hand out to each of them, which they took. Now, a couple of hours later, icy pellets of snow plinked on the stable roof as Carrie stood at the opening to the courtyard, listening for snapping twigs, running footfalls, a voice from the shadows, anything. Though the fugitives would surely be long gone by now. From inside the stable, a horse whinnied, then silence again, except for the patter of sleet. Footsteps now behind her, a man's. Carrie spun around, reached for a shovel propped against a wall. Cabot stepped quietly through the doors leading to the porte cochere. I should have been back at Battery Park by now, as I'd planned. Slowly, Carrie lowered her shovel. I confess I was slow leaving the estate, maybe not wanting to go be alone at Battery Park, and then when I saw Bergamini bolting out of the kitchen exit with his brother on his shoulders... Carrie was grateful for the silence. If he had questions for her, she had no real answers for him. It had been only instinct that made her side against LeBlanc, and instinct could sometimes be wrong. From the approach road came the clatter of steel on stone, a horse galloping, which might have been LeBlanc leaving, or merely venturing deeper into the estate.
This is the end of disc number 7. Please insert disc number 8. This is disc number 8.
Head down, Carrie traced the perimeter of the courtyard, its eastern wall rounding toward the north where the arched barn doors opened to the stable. Without speaking, Cabot followed, his gaze tracking hers on the snow-dusted pavers. Only one set. He's still carrying Carlo here, Cabot said, looking at her. He'd have to, if he wants to make any time. Cabot looked away. The owner of Bon Marché told George he's been worried about a mob deciding who was guilty for the death of the reporter at the station. This detective on the hunt for Bergamini won't help. Carrie twitched at the word mob, a distant memory flickering in her head, her father's face in a crowd, men shouting, fists raised, axes held up overhead like weapons. Closing her eyes, she tried to recall more, but couldn't. Inside the stable, the outlines of footprints in snow disappeared, but it wasn't hard to guess which direction they'd gone at this point. Staying anywhere connected to Biltmore's main house would not be safe, and the far double doors were cracked open to the forest beyond. It occurred to Carrie again that John Cabot might not be worthy of trust. But with the twins inside the house and Rima taking a shift back at the cabin, Carrie had no other allies, except perhaps George Vanderbilt, who'd seemed oddly unconcerned, and possibly even approving of her letting Cedric barrel into the banquet hall and distract from the search for a killer. Pulling her eyes from Cabot's, Carrie stepped to the north doors of the barn that led into a clearing and then the woods. The small icy pellets of snow were turning into larger flakes, the sky gone the color of the inside of a summer cattail, a dazzling white. Temperature dropping, the wind whistled through the cracked door of the stable, and there, disappearing now under the snow, were the tracks, walking into the forest, into the storm. "If we hurry," Carrie began. But even as they watched in the dim spill of lantern light, the footprints were fast being covered in white. Chapter 37. Taking one of the lanterns from its hook on the stable wall, Carrie steeled herself against the cold and followed what little she could still make out of broken sticks or crushed leaves or the edge of a shoe print on the path. Cabot followed closely behind. Looking up into the falling snow, she shook her head. "I can't track them in this. The last of their trail will be covered in another few minutes." Cabot fell in beside her as they retraced their path. Carrie took a step toward the basement door she and the twins had been assigned for the holidays. She'd seen them safely asleep hours ago. She was exhausted. Yet in a few hours, at first light, she and the twins would trudge through the snow to spend Christmas morning with their father, in whatever state they might find him. "Thank you," she said, turning partly back, "for searching with me." But John Cabot touched her fingers. "It's past midnight, so it's Christmas Day." She blinked, tipping her face up toward his. "So it is, yes. Perhaps not the happiest Christmas we've ever known." That sorrow that slipped over his face had fallen back. "But I do wish you good tidings and peace." She stood there a moment, her fingers still just touching his, a current flowing between them, a jolt, and something else, something steadier that ran underneath. A shared sadness and loss and raw pain that somehow, instead of seeming out of place on Christmas, felt strangely fitting, as if sadness and loss and raw pain had a place inside joy, part of what made it real. The whole staff and the entire Vanderbilt clan gathered to watch the owner of Biltmore disperse gifts. Carrie's thoughts kept winging off toward the Italians somewhere out there in the snow, and toward her father, who'd never come to consciousness this Christmas morning as she and Tully and Jersey cleaned his bedclothes. They'd tromped through the woods gathering more firewood for the stove and stoked it full, though only beside their father's bed, pushed so close to the wood stove that the quilts could nearly catch fire was it not miserably cold in the barn. Carrie repositioned the quilts they'd hung on the walls in order to block more of the north wind. They'd sung old Appalachian carols softly and tried to pour warm pine needle tea between his lips. "For inflammation," Carrie told the twins, "and he needs more liquid." Because the fiddle on the wall looked as if it ought to be picked up on Christmas, she'd leaned into every haunting verse of Greensleeves, with Jersey on one side of the squirrel skin and gourd banjos, and Tully on the singing bow. Jersey kept his head down so no one could see a young mountain man's tears. Tully knew the words of the carol that had been set to the old English folk tune, and the notes of her soft soprano floated in the silence of the barn. "What child is this who lays to rest?" Their father's eyelids fluttered at the words, but he had not otherwise stirred. Now Tully and Jersey sat among the other children of estate workers, each opening a hand-selected gift, but it was the owner of the estate, eyes shining as he distributed packages, that Carrie watched most closely. "I don't think," said a man's voice behind her, "I've seen George even remotely this happy before." John Cabot stood there against the doorframe. Carrie watched the owner of Biltmore presenting the next child with her gift, a doll in green velvet with a green velvet parasol. The child blinked, speechless. in wonder at the porcelain face, then up at the owner of Biltmore, whose eyes glowed. Even more, Carrie agreed, than he is with his books and his art, and equally as much as he is with his mountains. She exchanged a smile with Cabot, and was grateful there was sorrow in his face along with a smile, just as she knew there was in hers. She'd admired framed Currier and Ives prints at a Barnard friend's home. Part of her, though, had suspected the people in those lithographed sleighs and those glowing homes were also weighed down with secrets and worry and illness, which perhaps made the insistently giddy jingle of those sleigh bells hard to bear some days. Other days, maybe, the sleigh bells got to drown everything out. From the refrigeration rooms where Carrie had just finished her work, she padded up the back stairs. As the string quartet migrated from the banquet hall to the winter garden, she could slip through shadows at the back of the house undetected. Surely no one else would think to come to the library tonight. The last hint of smoke tendrilled from the maple logs in the fireplace. Pulling Nicholas Nickleby and Middlemarch from one of the unpacked boxes, Carrie dragged an armchair close to the embers. Not even opening the books, she held them close to her nose, smelled their leather, felt the supple spines. She'd read both during her time in New York, and now it felt like she was gathering their characters around her like friends. Feet aching, she closed her eyes. From the winter garden, the string quartet's performance of a Handel composition drifted through the house, amplified by limestone walls and marble floors. A single footstep a few yards away. Carrie bolted upright in the armchair. John Cabot stood in the shadows to the right of the fireplace. Might have been there all along, in fact, and her too exhausted to notice. "Forgive me, I've startled you." She stood. "I can go." "No, that is, please don't." He stood at an angle to the fire, his profile toward her. "George mentioned he'd given you full access to his library, for what little spare time you might have. Still, I should go." She was turning when she realized what he was holding, a volume of The American Architect, with a maroon bookmark. Someone left this sitting out. As if he were suddenly not conscious of her being there, he laid 2 fingers of his right hand on his left lapel, the same sign she'd seen him make at the depot in New York. "The article about your family's home on Beacon Hill." "Former home." She waited for him to go on. John Cabot put the book down and thrust his hands into his pockets as he stared into the fire. "I wonder if you'd allow me to tell you the story behind that article, that is, the story that came after it." "Of course." Carrie could see the pain that tightened the corners of his eyes. "I don't speak easily of my life to those I don't know well, those I don't have ample reason to trust. I hope it's not too presumptuous forgive me if I say that you strike me as utterly trustworthy. I think," she said softly, "I can forgive you for that." "It seems somehow deceitful not to tell you." He paused, then nodded to the issue of American Architect. "It happened shortly after that article came out. Both my parents and my sister Adelaide drowned late that summer in a sailing accident off Nantucket. I'd just gone back to Harvard for my final year." "That," she struggled for words, her throat tight, "that must have been horrific." His eyes drifted to the fire. "I went on in a bit of a daze, I think, as if I were handling it well. I was not, I'm sorry to say. When the lawyers settled the estate, it also became clear my father had been in debt for years. I became the sole heir overnight, and the sole debtor. The house was actually sold just a few months." He nodded toward the volume Carrie held open, after the article's publication. Carrie's own gaze dropped to the fire. Suddenly cold, even there near the hearth, she shuddered. "I'm so very sorry." "I erect walls in my life, Not so much to keep others away, but to keep myself standing up. But then you've no doubt already perceived that. Cedric, who must have found his way here whenever Cabot came in, rose from the hearth to position himself directly under Carrie's left hand. Moving her fingers across the silky ears, Carrie did not raise her eyes from the coals. I sometimes notice bits and pieces that others don't, but it would appear I also sometimes puzzle the pieces together all wrong. She met his gaze and held it, the grief on his face so raw she could hardly keep from looking away. To lose your entire family at once. He stepped to the hearth and reached for a poker to stir the embers. You strike me as a person of great compassion. I suspect you've seen your own share of loss. All people of real compassion have, I believe. He turned. They looked at each other across the flickering dark. Losses change us. I've become a much less jovial man, less fun, I'm afraid, to be around. One end of his mouth attempted a smile. But I hope I've become a kinder, more compassionate man without fortune than I was with. She waited a moment before speaking again. I wonder if I could ask that sign you make. She placed 2 fingers of her right hand to the left side of her chest. My mother, like an unspoken I love you in settings where we couldn't speak, or when words weren't enough. She tucked us into bed with it when we were little, sent us off to school with it. He met her eye. We made the sign to each other before anyone left on a trip, including that one, to Nantucket, when she boarded the ferry from Cape Cod. Carrie's eyes filled at the image, a mother smiling on the deck of a ferry, 2 fingers of her right hand over her heart as she waved goodbye with the left to her son, headed back to his college. Her disappearing days later, along with her husband and daughter, into the sea. When he spoke again, it was quietly. And you? Your life can't have been easy, I suspect. She gazed longer into the fire. Every day up until 2 years ago, my whole life was wondering how the next meal could be trapped or baited or skinned or pulled from the ground. I'd no idea a person could go day after day through winter and never feel the cold right down to the bone, never lie awake feeling the wind cut through the walls, the damp deep in the quilts and the straw. She raised her eyes to his. I spent the past 2 years at Barnard on scholarship, at the arrangement of a former schoolteacher who once taught here. I only returned this fall when my father became ill and my aunt, who'd cared for my brother and sister, came to work here at Biltmore. At least, she thought wryly, I can say the word without choking now. She shook her head. Honestly, I don't think I knew until coming back how desperately poor we were. I wish I could say, like you, that I'm the better for it. Surely the additional education you received, he spoke gently, nodding at the 2 novels she still clutched to her chest, was a great gift, and also a curse. It taught me envy like I'd never known before, knowing about what's out there in this big world, what I might have become. It haunts me, not all the time, but envy pokes its ugly head into my days. To have to return under your circumstances, I don't doubt that was hard. His eyes swept toward the tall windows where a bright winter moon lit the outlines of hemlocks. And yet, forgive me if I'm romanticizing these mountains, but there's something here that draws one in, and surely must draw one back, almost whether or not you want to be drawn. That's right, she said softly. That's it exactly. His eyes swung back to hers. If I may be incredibly intrusive. In the charged silence between them, he waited. She looked back warily. I wonder if I might ask you about your friendship with Madison Grant. Carrie would have been less astounded if he'd asked her the recipe for lye soap. My friendship with Madison Grant? His interest in you. Carrie saw again Grant's face as he offered his help at the train station and Battery Park. As he stepped close to her on the loggia, ran his hand down her arm. But Carrie had assumed no one noticed but her and Mrs. Smythe. Cabot looked away and then back. It has worried me. Carrie recalled what she'd perceived as John Cabot's rudeness, his curtness at the station, his scolding Grant for flirting with a village milkmaid, for remembering her name, that he'd targeted you as an innocent young thing he could seduce? Well, forgive me, yes. Mountain women, you may have noticed, are ferociously stubborn. She studied Cabot's face. There is something Mr. Grant suggested, though, that Aaron Berkowitz and his attacker were both in love with the same woman, Miss Barthélemy, I think, who might somehow have known them both prior to coming here. But the attacker? Good God! You mean me? He looked away. There are a number of reasons I should be a suspect, but my being in love with Lillian Barthélemy is not one of them. The strains of the quartet, now playing Strauss in the gallery, rose and swirled, the crackle of the embers underneath. Gently, John Cabot lifted the books from her hands and placed them on the chess table that sat near the fire. Then he opened his arms. I wonder, might I ask you to dance? She saw awkwardness pass into his face as soon as the words were out. That is, the waltz. I'm not sure if you know. She smiled up at him. I did learn, yes, in New York. Part of my friend's educating the backwood hillbilly. Just about to put her hands in his outstretched ones, she hesitated. But if someone were to come, then they must grab a partner and join us. He stepped closer, his evening coat smelling of wood smoke and leather book bindings and the outdoors. And a whiff, too, of Cedric. Holding one of her hands, he opened the window doors from the library leading to the terrace outside. The moon lit the snowflakes like glitter sifting to earth. With the distant strains of the quartet swelling, they stepped outside, faces upturned toward the bright flakes. Waltzing, they twirled through the falling snow. Lifting her face as they slowly spun to a stop, Carrie stepped in still closer to John Cabot's tall frame, let herself sink into the kiss. Sounds and sensations swirled around her, the deep stir of his kiss, the soft sifting of the snow on the pergola rafters and its withered wisteria vine, the far-off undulations of the violins, and from across the valley, the low bellow of a cow. She felt as if she had jumped from one of the mountain cliffs, but found herself able to glide on currents of air. She moved still closer into the kiss, her arms twining tightly around his neck. Slowly, slowly, she pulled her head back, but only to see his face, to see that his expression was inexpressibly tender, his eyes bright and intense on hers. Standing there, hearing her heart pound, Carrie suddenly went rigid. Marco Bergamini, she whispered. Hardly the time to whisper another man's name, but there it was, the words already out. From Bergamino. Cabot stepped back, his face quizzical but not angry. He waited for her to speak. It's a long shot, and LeBlanc surely. But if they stayed in the woods while he searched it... I'm afraid I'm not following you. I think I know the place we ought to look for them next. Chapter 38. LeBlanc glowered up at the night sky. Only moments ago, snowflakes had been fluttering softly down on his horse and him as they trudged through the estate. But now the flakes were landing with an icier, meaner plink, as if adjusting themselves to his mood. At least there was this. Catalfamo and that cripple of a brother of his could not travel far, unless they'd taken the train out of town like that chit of a girl Vanderbilt's niece had said. If they were still here in this cold, they could hardly sleep outside without freezing to death from exposure. That last possibility, he cheered himself, would at least expedite his mission. If he couldn't drag Catalfamo back to New Orleans, he could at least deliver a copy of a coroner's certificate. Leblanc had no reason to distrust George Vanderbilt, who'd have nothing to gain by involving himself. And yet he did distrust him. Something about the man, a softness maybe, around the eyes, made the owner of Biltmore look like someone who might just harbor a fugitive with some pathetic story and a cripple for a sidekick. This estate of Vanderbilt's was far too vast to ride over, something like 100,000 acres, maybe more, looking for a criminal. But the cold and now the sleet cut the scope of Leblanc's search down immensely. If the two Dagos were here on the estate, they'd have to take shelter somewhere indoors. For now, he'd done only a cursory search of the damn house, which was the size of a castle, and the stable, which was the size of a large house, since Catalfamo, like every criminal Leblanc had tracked, would have bolted as far away as he could from the one on his trail. Only because Vanderbilt's niece looked so stupidly sweet and innocent did Leblanc bother with checking the train station where she claimed to have seen the Italian on his way out of town. But the station master and the telegrapher had both looked at him blankly, said they'd not seen the pair of guineas come or go lately. The telegrapher, Farnsworth, had more to say when Leblanc slid another bill to him, but that only amounted to seeing too many guineas in these parts over the past several years, since Vanderbilt started building his house. And yeah, one of those types, along with a limping boy, had been at the station the night of the murder that still hadn't been solved. "Good rootin' out's what they'd be needin'," the telegrapher had said, taking a long pull on his cigarette, then blowing smoke on the other side of his telegraph office window. "Sure as hell can't let any more of them in. Whole country's going to hell. It's the good genes that's imperiled." Leblanc had turned back at this last word with a smirk. Imperiled? Fancy words for a hillbilly cable operator in a backwater spill of a town. Where the hell had he picked that up? After returning to the estate to search the conservatory and Vanderbilt's piggery, which left Leblanc's shoes stinking, he'd aimed his horse to his best target yet. Leblanc rousted a Biltmore nurseryman named Beadle out of bed to ask him about other outbuildings on the estate, and the man, at the sight of the Pinkerton badge, had groggily complied, then stumbled back to sleep. The dairy barn. That made perfect sense. It would be warmer than most other buildings. It was more remote from the house than the stable or conservatory, and Italians would feel right at home in the conditions, primitive, fit for animals. Now Leblanc, clutching a lantern, sat his horse in the sleet that speared down on them and surveyed the dairy barn from a hill above it. A clock tower rising over its main door was just visible in the faint glow of the moon, reflecting off a snow-covered roof and the pastures below. He spat to one side. Who had so much money to burn they built a clock tower for cows? Rich people like this funded his work, made the thriving of his professional life possible. But sometimes he could not stand them. Leblanc guided his nag in a circle of the barn, quiet here well past midnight. Gripping the lantern in one hand, he held it out from his body to search for footprints. Even being unfamiliar with snow, he was certain a man and a crippled child walking all the way from the main house or stables would surely have inadvertently left some indentations, if not actual tracks, if they'd come this way. In fact, he calculated now, the chill in his bones growing to a positive ache, a man and a badly crippled child probably couldn't have made it this far at all through the cold. Still, he would search, quickly, before his feet froze into solid blocks. Dismounting at the entrance to the barn, LeBlanc tied the nag to a post just under the tower and eased open the big barn door. Inside, he tried not to breathe in the smell of hay. He despised barns of all sorts, and his having to actually enter a stinking dairy barn on Christmas Day felt like an especial affront. He stood still to listen, silent but for the shifting and breathing of cattle and scuffling of mice. LeBlanc's sense of hearing was, if anything, sharper than his eyesight. No person, much less two, was hiding here in the barn. Ignoring the nag, whose head lifted slightly at his approach, as if this might be a sign they could leave, LeBlanc circled the barn's exterior again. Covered delivery wagons with the name Biltmore painted on the side stood in a row. Growing colder, angrier, and more exhausted by the moment, LeBlanc checked each one. Nothing but silver metal canisters, and no footprints anywhere. Only a hay wagon at the barn's northwestern corner sat alone. He approached, but now he could no longer feel his own feet. He and the nag still had to make it back to Asheville to get a few hours of sleep before dawn. For good measure, though, and because he was a thorough man, he snatched up 2 pitchforks leaning against the side of the barn. He hurled the first with such force that its prongs sliced deep into the hay. The second he threw even harder, its whole handle disappearing, just as he thought. No sound, nothing at all. So then, Catalfamo and his little brother, wherever they were tonight, had better plan to die of exposure, because by tomorrow when LeBlanc finally found them, and he damn well would find them, he'd make them sorry they'd cost him not only 4 years, but now, here at the end, LeBlanc knew he'd closed in, nearly a whole night of sleep and, in a few moments more, the use of his toes. LeBlanc retraced his steps to the entrance. In jerks that tried to put feeling back into his hands, he untied the nag, mounted, and aimed its nose toward the delivery road. With only the circle of light his lantern threw and the pale fuzz of moon, he couldn't see the mountains, but he knew they were there, and they made him nervous, pressing in and crushing like mountains did. Passing under the clock tower, he scowled up at it. A clock tower on a damn barn. As much as he loathed the criminal lowlifes he spent his days chasing, and as much as he detested dagos and mountains and barns, he decided he might just hate rich people worst of all. Chapter 39. Sal heard the rumble and jangle and crunch of a wagon approaching, but it was the wrong time of day. The dairy barn at Biltmore had come alive this morning before dawn, a platoon of local men arriving while it was still dark to light the lanterns and arrange the stools and gather the tin pails. He and Nico had burrowed themselves into the loft above the barn, which lay down the hill and across the lagoon from the main house, in the estate's bottomland near the French Broad River. At first, when they'd run from the stables, they'd hidden in the conservatory behind mounds of orchids and palms, but only for a few hours that night before Christmas. Sal knew LeBlanc would search there before long, so they'd left sometime in the dark, well after midnight, Sal guessed, and trudged through the woods to a far pasture, stopping again for warmth in a run-in shed, open on one side but blocking the wind on 3 others. They burrowed underneath mounded hay and kept each other, if not warm, but at least alive. Down the hill from the shed was the sprawling dairy barn. "Off past the barn is a hay wagon," Sal said to Nico. "We'll hide there just in case he comes to search the—" In the quiet, they both heard the crunch of LeBlanc's horse over the icy crust of snow before they could see his lantern round the bend in the delivery road. They stayed where they were while LeBlanc searched the barn, then re-emerged with the lantern and glared around him at the barnyard. They exchanged wide-eyed looks as he hurled 2 pitchforks into the wagon's load of hay. Once LeBlanc remounted his horse, standing up to its fetlocks in snow, and rode out of sight, Sal and Nico hobbled inside. Sal was limping now too, his feet numb from having crouched, unmoving, there in the woods for so long, and he carried Nico, who was nodding asleep from the cold. It was the cows and the blessed heat they threw off that warmed them. That, and burrowing themselves together deep in the hay of the loft. Just after dawn, when it appeared a worker would be climbing up to the loft, Sal had shinnied out through the upper window near the barn's clock tower and down a nearby maple, Nico clinging to his neck. They'd slipped back into the barn after the workers, finished with the morning milking, dispersed. On Christmas Day, and again today, the day after, the cows still had to be milked and fed and the deliveries completed, but most of the other work in the barn seemed to be suspended, on partial holiday, as if waiting quietly for the evening milking. It was afternoon now, all the wagons long since gone to deliver the Jersey cows' milk to the main house and the workers' families, and the surplus milk on its way to the hospital, a gift from Biltmore. From his time in the stables, Sal knew at least that much of the dairy barn schedule. No wagon should be rolling and racketing into the barnyard this time of day. With no weapon, Sal reached for a pitchfork. It would be no match for LeBlanc's pistol, but it gave him something to grip against a swell of helplessness. Edging from behind a mound of hay, Sal peered down to the barnyard, where he could see only the top of a Clydesdale's head. They'd not really eaten since the evening before last, Nico and him, except for a small cheese rind and a heel of bread a worker had left, and plenty of milk. At least, though, the two of them had managed to disappear. "Mr. Bergamini!" came a child's voice, or no, a voice that was almost a man's. Sal edged closer. Jersey McGregor's already large hands circled around a boy's mouth. "Mr. Bergamini, you there? Carrie says y'all are." "We got to hurry," his sister Tully bellowed, a large sound from such a piccola ragazza, such a small girl. From the driver's seat, Carrie shaded her eyes as she scanned the dairy barn's upper level, like she could make them out through the cracks in the boards. Nico reached out, letting Sal know they should go down. "Mi fido di te," Sal said quietly, echoing Nico. "I trust you." Sal tucked his hand under Nico's elbow, and the two of them tromped down the stairs from the loft and presented themselves, hay still clinging to their clothes and hair, in front of the wagon. Tully held out her hand in greeting. "Reckon you ain't got much choice, but we're real glad it's us you'll come out for." "Mr. Vanderbilt hisself give us the wagon to take," Jersey whispered, as if speaking too loudly might jinx their mission. Carrie leapt from the bench. "Mr. Bergamini of the cow herdin' and dairy farmin' Bergaminis, I'm glad you and Carlo are safe. I am grateful you thought of," he gestured to the dairy barn, "this." He shook her hand warmly. "The name is Sal, Salvatore Catalfamo. This is my brother Nico." Rounding to the rear of the wagon, she flipped back a horse blanket to reveal what they'd brought. "I'm fairly sure Mr. Vanderbilt knew why I was asking to borrow a wagon. He didn't ask where I was taking it, so he can answer anyone's questions by saying he doesn't know. I would like to tell to you the truth of New Orleans." He could see from the stiffening of her shoulders that she wasn't sure she wanted the truth, that she'd chosen to help on instinct alone. "Thank you, and soon. Right now we have to hurry, like Tully said." She slipped chicken baked with butter and thyme inside biscuits and handed one first to Nico and then to Sal. "We brought plenty more. Left in a hurry as soon as I could slip away without Mrs. Smythe seeing, and while Rima had time to help us pack something up." She winked at them both. "Rima wouldn't let us out the door of the kitchens without this." She peeled back cheesecloth to reveal a blackberry cobbler still steaming. Sal asked no questions, numb with hopes he was afraid to form into words. Jersey stepped forward shyly, red hair in his eyes. "Reckon we ought to say our howdies again. Glad to make your acquaintance, Mr. Salvatore Catalfamo." He grinned at the bounce of the name on his tongue. "You too, Nico." Before Sal had a chance to respond, Nico looked up from a big bite of cobbler, blackberry smeared across his mouth. "Grazie," he whispered, eyes filling. "Grazie mille." Glancing at Sal, Nico added to the McGregors, so low the twins had to lean forward to hear. "We trust you." Chapter 40. Quietly, Carrie slipped out the front door of Biltmore into a world of white. Mrs. Smythe would have turned a deep Liverpool purple at a servant using the front entrance, but Carrie was past caring. It had been several days since Christmas, Carrie having snuck twice more to the dairy barn with food, both times after dark once the last worker had left. Today, since it was Sunday, she'd have the day off, from Biltmore at least. She'd spend it caring for her father as she did every early morning and night the rest of the week. She'd been testing the limits of how little sleep a person could get and still function. But there had to be a point coming soon when the tide of exhaustion, always lapping at her, would one day crash over her head and carry her off. Today she'd be with Tully and Jersey. That lightened her mood as she turned to admire Biltmore's copper roof caps and spires glinting above the snow. Two gardeners bent into the task of shoveling paths straightened to wave to her. With no guests awake and George Vanderbilt likely ensconced in his observatory at the highest point of the house, and with the servants tiptoeing about, Biltmore sat serenely quiet but for the shush of the shovels against the snow. Carrie felt strangely warm as she walked, despite having left her father's coat for the twins. It was as if those moments shared with John Cabot on Christmas night were still sending the blood coursing through her. Which was why, she told herself sternly here in the clear light of day, she had to be wary. Despite the deep swirling pull of that night, and despite what she'd learned of his story, there were still reasons for caution. Like the cliché of the servant girl falling for the handsome gentleman on the grand estate, convinced that he loved her, only to find she'd been just an amusement. John Cabot seemed nothing if not authentic, but wasn't that what every abandoned young woman said, looking back? And he'd somehow known Aaron Berkowitz before that night on the train platform, yet he'd volunteered nothing to Wolf that evening. For a man who claimed to value transparency of the heart so highly, there was something unsettling about his not divulging that he'd known the murder victim before. She didn't have to let his rumpled good looks or her sympathy for him pull her feet out from under her like the French broad in a flood. She'd have to exercise caution. Carrie veered into the woods, the snow thick. The beeswax she'd rubbed into her shoes helped only so much with moisture, her stockings wet through now. At the barn, Tully and Jersey were up and dressed, Tully's hair neatly braided, Jersey's in its rooster comb. The three of them changed their father's bedclothes, the air once they were done smelling of the pine needle tick. Carrie kissed each twin on the top of the head. "So, has he said anything?" The twins exchanged glances. "Okay, you two, what's that about?" Jersey frowned at Tully, then at their father, just beginning to stir. "He said not to tell." "I don't care, Jers, I'm not keeping secrets from Carrie." Carrie's hands went to her hips. "Whatever it is, I'm guessing I need to know." Jersey sighed but said nothing, crossing his arms. Carrie focused in on her sister, who strapped on every responsibility like a soldier with his pack. Tully had no capacity for shrugging off duty. "Spoke just enough yesterday to ask Jersey to take a message," she blurted. "A message?" "Jers took a kind of letter thing, delivered to Biltmore." "To Biltmore?" Carrie stared at her brother. "And you didn't tell me?"
Jersey sulked. Said I was to deliver it straight to Mr. George Vanderbilt. Said I most of all wasn't to tell you. Carrie took a breath to steady her anger. And what exactly did the letter say? No idea. Had it folded up tight. Said I wasn't to open it. Where'd he even get the paper or pen? No idea about that either. Looked to me like it was maybe some kind of fancy paper somebody must have give him somehow. Alls I know was he told me I was to take it down there. Carrie turned back to her father, his eyes open now, his breathing shallow, uneven. Well then, would you like to tell me about that letter you had Jersey deliver? If he heard, nothing in his face moved. Or maybe you want to tell me about that photograph with you and Robert Bratchett. What it's got to do with your looking riled up when he comes around. Still no movement at all, his eyes closed again. Tully tugged on Carrie's sleeve. He slipped on off back to sleep. Aunt Reema's coming to take a watch over, so the three of us can slip off to the chapel. Uneasy, Carrie kissed Reema's cheek when she arrived and let the twins pull her away. Carrying 2 cane fishing poles and a spear, they slipped unseen around the edge of the clearing and into the back of the chapel, their Methodist church down by the branch that flowed so close to the corner of the square little structure that in spring, when it swelled, it splashed up on the foundation and clapboard. The itinerant preacher would be coming later from Black Mountain, but they stayed only for the hymns, mournful and joyful at once. No instruments today, just the ragged little congregation standing wet from slogging through snow, the pot-bellied stove hissing, the singing rising to the hand-hewn rafters. Here were the pained and hopeful voices of people who knew despair was life, and life was despair, and grace was there for the taking. Come, thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy praise, streams of mercy never ceasing. Carrie stopped singing to listen to the babble of the branch instead, barely audible beneath the music. That branch, at least, she'd never seen dry. The mercies of the divine, on the other hand, seemed a whole lot less sure, at least from where she was standing with 4 hours of sleep, from serving a castle of American royalty by day and a dying father by night. Slipping out the back while the music still throbbed and thrummed from inside, Carrie and the twins walked upstream along the bank. Decades ago, the Cherokees had built weirs throughout the mountains, including here. A V of stones piled in the river with its wide mouth facing upstream to guide the trout toward a narrower, easier catch. Unwinding their lines of twined horsehair slicked with beeswax, Tully and Jersey began digging under the snow in the stream bank's soft soil for worms. Tully retied the bullet she'd melted and punched a hole in for a sinker. Carrie watched them a moment, then waded to the tip of the weir. Jersey grinned, watching. It's chancy, if you ask me. Water's ice cold if you slip in. And you used to could gig a trout in the gills without blinking, but 2 years laying out. Cocking back her arm, Carrie aimed her spear, a knife blade strapped with squirrel hide strips to a hoe handle, and let it fly. Back at the barn, the 3 of them cleaned and filleted their trout, then rolled the fillets in cornmeal and cracked pepper to cook on the griddle outside. Tully stomped back from the hen house with all the outrage of 13 years old, thwarted. Only gonorrhea laid this morning. King Lear, he just struts around like everything's just fine, and it's all thanks to him. Carrie gave her sister's braid a tug. So we'll make corn pone. Doesn't need eggs. All the hens'll lay tomorrow. Tully's lips pulled to one side. Your face has got some fret to it. Says you're afeard they won't. Carrie attempted a laugh. Then how about you don't look at my face and we'll both just pretend we believe they'll lay tomorrow. They washed their dirty clothes in the big iron pot outside over a fire, poking and turning with a long paddle, and making several trips each to the branch for more water. Carrie's hands were raw from the heat and the lye, her hair frizzed from the steam.
Bending over the pot, she mulled over the people of Biltmore. Lily Barthelemy's going pale each time the Italian stable hand had walked near. The letter she'd gotten with Dirk's handwriting, that made her hands shake. Madison Grant with all his veneer of wealth and polish, but also his leering, the hateful things he spewed about immigrants and Jews, and who knew what else. Dirk's resentful reactions to the newcomers, his fit at the Christmas tree raising, his seething under someone's influence, apparently Grant's, or Farnsworth's, or both, someone who stoked his fears. Sal's initial attempt to disguise whatever his connection might be with New Orleans, then his fleeing from the Pinkerton man. Even John Cabot, part of his story making sense now, the tragedy of his family, his anger in the face of Grant's flirtation with Carrie. But his having withheld the truth, his somehow knowing the murdered reporter. She was still bending over the steaming lye when rattling bridles and creaking saddles and a low rumble of voices sounded above the trickle of the half-frozen falls. 3 men on horseback appeared at the edge of the clearing. George Vanderbilt rode first, closely followed by his agent, Charles McNamee, who'd been trying for years, even well before Carrie left for New York, to purchase the McGregor land. His presence alone was enough to make her want to run and grab the breech loader. She barely heard McNamee's words, because behind him rode John Cabot, looking ashamed of being there with them. Yet here he was, part of this unasked-for visit, this intrusion. "So, if we might speak with your father on business," McNamee was finishing. Through Carrie's blur of confusion and rising rage, she could see the agent was smiling, that his easy manner assumed he'd be welcomed. He was already shifting his weight, about to dismount. She batted curls back from her face. "Our father is unable to accept visitors today, and I cannot imagine any reason he'd have to speak with you about any matters of business." Vanderbilt looked confused. McNamee looked unflappably confident, and Cabot looked pained. "Carrie," he began. She ignored him. By being here with these men, he'd made himself their ally. Charles McNamee drew from his pocket a folded letter. "I do apologize if it's an inconvenient time. We can certainly come back." "I cannot imagine," Carrie heard herself say, her voice hoarse and unfamiliar to her own ears, "there'd be a reason to do so." McNamee held up the paper, a Vanderbilt crest embossed at its top and several lines of neatly flowing script down its page. This design, with its central V and twining leaves, she saw now, was considerably different from the one in the telegrapher's office with its fleur-de-lis and silhouette of a Gallic rooster. The crest she'd first assumed was Vanderbilt's doing. Where McNamee was pointing now, though, was under the flowing script, where 5 crudely formed words had been scrawled in what appeared to be charcoal. Carrie knew before she deciphered the blurred lines what the message would amount to. Watching her face, her stomach churned as she read aloud, "Ready to talk Céline femme." Chapter 41. Late Winter, 1896. In a daze since leaving New York in a late winter freezing rain, Lily did not know the names of the hamlets they passed as the train climbed into the mountains, nor did she care, not with all she had on her mind. She smoothed the brown satin of her traveling dress, tight over the waist and flaring like a bronze bell just past the hips. But how well she looked in the dress wasn't first on her mind either. The only part of this trip she dreaded was arriving at Biltmore Junction station, where the reporter had died. She refused to think the word killed and certainement not murder. "You know," said a man's voice from behind her, "you've seemed distracted and quiet this entire trip. Not much like you, Miss Barthélemy, if I may say so." Madison Grant. How she loathed the man. That was the one other thing she dreaded about coming, having to share the travel with him. She smiled at him wanly and wondered if he could see contempt on her face. "Indeed, Mr. Grant, no doubt a few weeks at Biltmore will cure that. This landscape, how lovely." She could feel Grant watching her from his upholstered chair as she gazed out the window. The crystal chandelier at the car center swayed as they rounded the next curve. The wheels beneath them clacked out the time, all these minutes wasted with Grant staring at her, because what she wanted to do was open the letter. And the truth was, the landscape was only lovely this time of year if you liked bare silver limbs and pines that grew straight out of cliffs. Lillian Barthélemy had been born and bred in New Orleans, and she thought none of these things were lovely, although she ought to try harder to see the beauty in them. Her being invited back to Biltmore meant George wanted her here. For all his interest in art and farming and philanthropy, he must have felt enough attraction for her that he'd renewed his invitation just after New Year's to join a small party of friends back in the Blue Ridge. Madison Grant, she'd heard through society grapevines, had not been invited back explicitly. Rather, he'd made it clear he wanted to learn more of Biltmore's strides in forestry and had essentially invited himself as a leader in American land preservation. Grant was well enough connected in the same social and intellectual circles as George that bluntly banning the man from Biltmore would have been a central topic of society gossip, which, as Lily knew well, George avoided at all costs. Look how far from New York he'd come to build his home. "I say," Grant sounded like every American who wished he were English, pretentious. She cut him off with a quick lean toward the window. "Perfectly lovely." She said it loudly, trying for George's sake to mean it this time. "Indeed, although given my own work, I should point out the ravaging of the natural resources. These people chose to desecrate their land." Lily was no social reformer, but it did strike her that they might have had less choice in the matter than a man like Madison Grant, who'd never once in his life needed to cut down a tree or plant a crop for his next meal. Keeping her face to the window, she began easing open the envelope with her finger. Grant was droning on. "George's purchase of the land will rectify this depletion with intentional, sustainable forestry, and furthermore—" She'd plucked the letter from its sleeve now. Her fingers ran over the page as if they could read its message for her. Grant seemed to have switched topics from his precious conifers to a costume ball at Mrs. Astor's. Would he never hush? It was one thing to tolerate the posturing of men who might benefit her in some way, but a man who could do her no personal good. "A Yale man like you, Mr. Grant, with a multitude of connections, not to mention your work saving the American bison and the noble pronghorn, must stay terribly busy." Like a bone tossed to a yapping dog, the flattery was meant to pacify him into silence a while. "I believe, Miss Barthélemy, that I saw you at the Met a number of times over the winter, though never, to my surprise, with our friend Vanderbilt." Lily leveled a gaze at him and did not answer the question implied. "Although," he went on, "he's done us both the honor of having us back to Biltmore." She refused to betray to Madison Grant her own disappointment that George, known to attend the opera sometimes 4 times in a week, had not asked to escort her there a single time during the season. Still, she was on his private train car, his niece Emily asleep in an armchair in the far corner, and they would be staying at the house itself this time, now that Biltmore had officially opened. Which, Emily had commented just this morning at the station, is far more than any other young woman of our set has achieved so far. She'd squeezed Lily's arm. Grant lifted a magazine from the mahogany table to his left. I do so like the opera. Yes, she agreed, so she could ignore him. She despised opera. It was indoors for one thing. It attracted the types who cared about social rules for another. The only risks she faced there were leaning too far out over a box seat or having her name not listed in the Some Happenings in Good Society feature of the New York Times as one of the glittering people present. Also, on the high notes, Lily always wanted to scream. Madison Grant flipped open the Harper's magazine. Facing the train window, Lily glanced down. But she got no further than recognizing the same, nearly indecipherable hand as the letters before. Grant, impossible man, popped from his armchair to walk toward her, the open Harper's held out. You might well be intrigued by this article on the cotton mills of the Appalachian Piedmont. She gave him the most wan of smiles, the more polished version of her standing at the back of his chair and shrieking into his ear, "Why the hell would I be interested in that?" He appeared to be one of those men who could not read smiles. He held the magazine so close to her face she had to push it away a few inches to focus. Pictures of little children in front of giant spools appeared. Rather than skim the article itself, Lily scanned the captions, even as she flipped her letter face down. How striking! The pictures piqued her interest in spite of herself. How young these workers are. Just little children. Although one wonders if they derive from genetic stock that could perform at higher levels. Probably not. The mills may actually be a beneficent alternative to slums. Lily intended to push the vile thing away, but more of its rather distressing pictures, little girls in pigtails clambering up on machines that dwarfed them, drew her in. And then the byline, by John Cabot. An early peek, one would assume, into the book he's been researching. I'd be delighted to borrow the Harpers from you, Mr. Grant, just as soon as I've had the opportunity to catch up on my correspondence. Of course. He dropped the Harpers on the table in front of her. No hurry in returning it to me, as I've had the chance to peruse it. Waiting until he'd settled himself back into his claret-colored chair, she scanned the letter. The messages like this had stopped when she'd left Biltmore before the holidays. But just as she was leaving her mother's on Park Avenue, about to climb into the Sloan carriage headed for Grand Central Depot, the butler had presented this one. As if the horrid thing might disintegrate into the clouds and steam of the station if she pretended it wasn't there in her handbag. She'd not so much as looked at it until now. But now, Lily scanned the letter. Again, only a handful of words. Police come knocking, stuck to my side of the story. Found out why it was you wanted B stopped. Reckon you'd wish I hadn't. The threat he meant to imply, the blackmail to come, was perfectly clear. Lily laid a hand at her own throat. Chapter 42. At the far end by the fireplaces, all blazing tonight, 3 musicians played classical pieces. The cellist and flutist bobbed their heads in time with the strains of Strauss, one of the composers Carrie had learned to recognize during her time in New York. A fiddler who'd once owned a farm near the McGregors gripped his bow sternly, as if he feared any minute it might break from his carefully executed violin part into a riff of "Come all you fair and tender ladies." As Carrie unloaded the dumbwaiters to fill the footmen's sterling trays, Moncrief kept up a running commentary peppered with Scots Gaelic. They're up to high dough, keyed up if you're asking me, and the one's got an angry streak as long as me arm. She settled the Charlotte Russe onto his tray. Which one?
The lawyer preservationist blether. I dinna ken his name. It's a peely-wally face he has, pale as a poisoned ghost."
Carrie laughed. "I got very little idea what you said, but I know who you mean, Mr. Grant.
It's pale his face is, makes a sport of the trio blade of stirring up trouble."
For her part, Carrie noticed Grant fingering the outline of something, a slight bulge in his jacket pocket. Stirring up trouble seemed about right. After dinner, Mrs. Smythe summoned her. "They've decided to retire to the bowling alley." She said this last part as she might have discussed London's sewer system, a part of the city best not mentioned. "As that divvy Scots of a footman is needed to reset the 9 pins, I'm told, and all the rest of the staff occupied in the oak room just now, I'd like you to take the port to the guests who've chosen to," she sniffed, "bowl." Moncrief was bounding about setting up the pins that had been left splayed all over the 2 parallel lanes. Carrie stood near the threshold until he could set up a table for the port, which gave her time to observe the group. Lillian Barthélemy and Mr. Vanderbilt's niece Emily had both returned. They stood in dresses more casual than their evening gowns, the jewels they'd worn to dinner stored away. John Cabot turned as she walked in with the wine, and he held her eyes. When after a few beats, Carrie looked away, Lily Barthélemy tilted her head at an angle that said she'd taken note. Cabot studied his ball. Then, shoving 3 fingers awkwardly into its slots, he slammed it toward the pins, sending them flying. Leaping horizontally several feet, Moncrief caught one pin in midair before he and it hid the wood floor. "Airleth, Mathari Reed! Excellently done, sir." Madison Grant lifted a glass of port from Carrie's tray. "As brutal with the pins as he once was with bodies on the gridiron." "Mon Dieu," Lily Barthélemy said. "Enough with the football." Marching to the left lane, she sent a ball slicing through pins, leaving only one standing. Grant lifted his glass in a mock toast. "A sport for the making of men, by which I mean not only football, but also bowling, when Miss Barthélemy takes the lane." She ignored him. "Football," Emily Sloane pronounced, "will not catch on outside a handful of places, not permanently. Mark my words." Grant shook his head. "I will say only this. To see a player like Cabot here leap with the grace of a gazelle over piles of fallen men, that was a thing of beauty. Although I'd forgotten how clumsy of me." He turned to the others. "Cabot prefers we not discuss that particular Harvard-Yale game. Issues, as I recall, of the extraordinary brutality of several players." Lily Barthélemy waved this away. "Nothing that the introduction of the forward pass shouldn't address." In the stunned silence that followed, she held a hand to her chest, delicately. "That is, I believe I read as much. Obviously, I've not followed the sport myself." Mrs. Smythe appeared sputtering at the entrance to Biltmore's bowling alley. "Mr. LeBlanc to see you again, sir." She lowered her voice. The sophistication chipped off her accent when she was under stress, and the Liverpool showing through. "I told the Mef he'd not been invited, I did, but he pushed himself in, that one, as if." Carrie braced herself against the cold stone of the alley's wall as LeBlanc's form hulked past Mrs. Smythe. He wasted no time with preamble. "Against my own better judgment, I followed a lead out of town, a trail that went a whole hell of a lot of nowhere." He leveled a glower at Emily Sloane. "Now I'm more convinced than ever there's damn well got to be a connection between a killer escaping justice in New Orleans and what happened here. Catalfamo was the common factor. So, since the local police are incompetent rubes, who here wants to give me the official Biltmore version of the train station murder?" Carrie kept her eyes focused directly ahead on the opposite wall. To her right, though, she sensed Lily Barthélemy drawing herself up, stiff, defensive. Vanderbilt began by meeting LeBlanc's eyes coolly, then handed him a glass of port from Carrie's tray. "Let's agree, LeBlanc, that this will be the last time you barge into my home uninvited. Shall we?" LeBlanc's upper lip lifted in the beginning of a sneer, but his gaze darted around the bowling alley and, as if suddenly reminded of Biltmore's sheer size and its owner's influence, his mouth flattened. Agreed. Briefly, George Vanderbilt recounted what happened. When he finished, Madison Grant sauntered forward. "Mr. LeBlanc, you have a point about the Italian." "My God," Cabot muttered. "Here we go again." Grant's hand brushed the lines of the square bulge in his coat pocket again. Perspiration dotting his forehead, he'd not shed his jacket like the other gentlemen who were bowling in shirt-sleeves. The man slipped away out of sight, as I understand it, moments before the attack occurred. Cabot stepped to the right lane. "If that's the criterion, they'd better suspect me as well." Emily Sloane clutched the ball close to her chest, but did not approach Elaine. "No one, Mr. Cabot, suspects you." Cabot's gaze shifted toward Carrie as she stepped to refill Vanderbilt's port. Grant sent a ball down the right lane, so badly aimed that Moncrief had to jump to keep his legs from being knocked out from under him. "I assume," he said, turning, "we all see what the actual suspects have in common, yes?" The thunder and crash of the balls and pins stilled. Even Moncrief quit moving. "I'll spell it out then," said Grant, "if no one else will." Emily Sloane drummed her heels on the wood floor. "Not this again, surely. Let us be honest. We all know the tendency of certain races toward criminality." Vanderbilt reached for another port, but only swirled it. "Do we all know that? Our top universities, all the best minds in eugenics agree, and America is currently leading the efforts to encourage superior genetic strains." Cabot lifted a ball, and for a moment, Carrie thought he would hurl it at Grant. Instead, he thrust it at him. "I confess I must amend my earlier assessment of you. You're not just a silly, self-important, ignorant man. You're a lethally ignorant one." LeBlanc stomped several paces. "Look, I got a case here to solve." As if he'd not heard, Grant took the ball. "We don't allow religion or false sentimentality to cloud our findings on race and social progress." "Such as," Cabot suggested bitingly, "caring for the hungry, the outcast, the stranger in the land." Grant's shoulders hunched. Brittleness, Carrie thought, behind the smooth finish, like mountain clay that, without a kiln, would hold no more than shadows. "I would refer you, Cabot, to our colleagues in Germany, assisting in our cutting-edge work." "Frankly," LeBlanc cut in, "I don't give a damn about any of this. I got me a killer to catch." Grant straightened, stroking the square lines of something inside his coat pocket again. "I still wonder." Carrie heard her own words before she realized she'd said them. All eyes turned to her as if one of the bowling pins had begun to speak. "If Miss McGregor," Cabot put in, "has something to say." "Sure," LeBlanc snorted. "Why the hell not waste more of my time? Let the damn maid blather now." But Vanderbilt turned to her. "By all means, if you have something to add." Carrie squared her shoulders. "I know comparatively little of the new science of fingerprinting. However, their blinks of disbelief, so preposterous that a maid would insert what was supposedly her knowledge of science, rattled her only a moment. We did touch on it in one class at Barnard, how it will become a significant tool for police. It's a shame the science isn't further along, since the phylacteries, the black boxes used to accompany prayer, found at the scene might give some sort of clue." LeBlanc frowned. "Yeah, so make your point." Vanderbilt spoke more kindly. "But since those boxes belong to the victim himself, I'm not sure that would be of much help." John Cabot inclined his head. I suspect she means something more. Carrie's gaze shot to Grant, his hand brushing the square bulges in his pocket again. It was a guess on her part, based only on the square outlines his fingers repeatedly traced, and his pointed mentions of the reporters being Jewish. But maybe the guess was worth the risk. She addressed Vanderbilt. You're right that Mr. Berkowitz's prints would of course be there, but so would those of the person who took the items from the scene. Those prints would not necessarily point to the killer, but it's an interesting question. Why exactly someone would have taken items related to the victim's religion and background? In a silence that felt dangerous, flammable even, Carrie thought, none of the guests looked at one another. Carrie shifted her gaze now to Madison Grant, though she continued to address Vanderbilt. Since one of your guests was clever enough to have brought the phylacteries with him tonight, perhaps he could answer that himself. As one, all eyes shifted to Madison Grant. He stood frozen, a bowling ball held poised to aim. His face fast draining of color, he looked as though he might drop the ball now on his own feet. Slowly, he lowered it. Carrie could see the calculations in the sparking of his narrowed eyes. The whole group was staring at his left pocket. Now an easy smile slid over his face. Apparently, LeBlanc, we have a potential addition to the Pinkerton force right here on the kitchen staff of Biltmore. She is precisely right that I brought these very items here tonight to show Vanderbilt, although I'd quite forgotten I had them with me until this moment. He turned toward Carrie, the dazzling smile on his lips at odds with the cut and slice of his glare. Allow me to thank you for that reminder. From his coat pocket, he drew out the 2 phylacteries. Cracked, Carrie noticed, as if someone took a cudgel to them, as if Grant relished doing violence to them, just like someone took a rail dog to the reporter's head. Grant relinquished them to Vanderbilt, who turned them over in his hands. Good Lord, Grant, it's as if you'd smashed them on purpose. LeBlanc elbowed his way closer. Worse for the damn wearer, I'd say. Made here's actually right. There's work in some parts of the world, Argentina for one, where fingerprints have solved a crime. Change the whole game if they can perfect it. Match fingerprints to that rail dog, for instance, and presto, murder solved. Interesting, Madison Grant observed, that you would associate the Italian word presto with murder. How fitting. LeBlanc turned his heft on Grant. My feelings exactly, although I got to say, it's odd as hell you'd have these. Anybody tell you that you can't take souvenirs from a crime scene? John Cabot sent a searching gaze toward Carrie, as if he was trying to guess how she'd known. LeBlanc spun to him. And you, Mr. John Quincy Cabot, did a little background research on you. You and this Berkowitz, you were students at Harvard at the same damn time. The bowling alley stilled again. Yes, Cabot said quietly. Yet, LeBlanc demanded, you didn't manage to speak up when that idiot sheriff here was asking if anyone knew the deceased or had information. Anything? He blew air out of his mouth. It's not even necessarily my case, this thing at the train station, but I can tell you right now there's been plenty of lies. Plenty of people not speaking up with what they know. Carrie watched John Cabot's eyes grow hard again and look away. Grant lifted a ball casually. Ridiculous to think it might be Cabot, but certainly whoever the killer was, he would have to be athletic to wield a thing like that rail dog. LeBlanc shot both hands in his coat pockets as his gaze swept the room, stopping on each one of the guests. The thing about detective work, no one else moved. You think you're getting nowhere, and then, presto! He fixed Grant with a look. Suddenly something falls into place. Grant seemed to coil back into himself, eyes narrowed. Like a rattler, Carrie thought, before it strikes. LeBlanc's gaze swung over the guests again now. Skipping, Carrie noticed, only Lily Barthélemy, who stood haughty and distant. The lady raised her chin. "That will be all now, LeBlanc." She spoke icily, but also as if she had some sort of connection with, or power over, the man. She drew a breath, as if to steady herself, and glanced toward Vanderbilt, as if she'd just realized she'd let her irritation with LeBlanc slice away her caution in not revealing a link before. George Vanderbilt had indeed turned to look at her quizzically, but said nothing. LeBlanc, running a hand once down his black triangle of beard, opened his mouth as if he would speak. Then, closing it, he spun away on one heel and stalked out. Chapter 43. "Lils?" Emily asked, bewildered. "Surely you couldn't have known this Mr. LeBlanc?" Lily felt their eyes like weights on her. She'd shown too much of her hand. "Forgive me," she said. "I seem to have a bit of a headache." They'd assumed she'd gone to her room, the Chippendale, with its 2 separate Renoirs. She'd gushed about them this morning to George, but truly, all she saw was a dull girl with an orange. Like a sea creature drawn to water, she ducked into the swimming pool's vaulted room down the corridor and shredded the silk of her stockings as she yanked them off.
This is the end of disc number 8. Please insert disc number 9. This is disc number 9.
Hiking up her skirts, she lowered herself to the pool's edge, bare toes skimming the water, which, bon Dieu, was actually warm, strangely sensual, which made her think of the Italian, the strength of his arms as he'd carried saddles from the tack room, the way, when she'd been near, he kept his hands frenetically busy, brushing and oiling and stretching and buckling, often repeating work he'd just done. The smolder and fire in his eyes when he looked at her, stepped close to her, arms tensed by his side. She arched her feet in the water. Extraordinary, really, how Biltmore catered to its guests every woman need, except peace of mind. Lily sighed. If she looked scandalous with her skirt hiked up like this and her calves bare, well, so be it. She had good calves. Now, if she could just slash through her corset strings, that would be perfect. Alone for some time, she felt her spine relax. Then, from across the corridor at the pool's far end, sounds echoed off the stone walls, from the gymnasium. Rising, Lily padded to the door to peer across. The climbing rope, the weights neatly lined on one wall, the parallel bars. But only the male guests could use it. Not seeing her, Madison Grant, in a sleeveless shirt, turned, his arms oyster white and without definition, his gut rounding out like a puff of uncooked beignet. He leveraged up from the floor a bar with weighted plates. "Simple physics," he murmured to himself as he strained to press it over his head. "Angles more than mere muscular power." Here came the maid Carrie, scurrying past the broad entrance to the gymnasium. "Ah," Grant called. "Carrie." Ducking into the pool's room, Carrie flattened her back against the wall. The maid and Lily regarded each other in silence for a long moment. Lily studied her, the red hair pulled back into a maid's cap, with rogue wisps curling around the face, the sunburned cheeks, even here in winter, the chapped hands, their knuckles cracked, nearly bleeding as she clutched a bottle of port in one hand, a glass in the other. Without a word, the maid stepped forward, filled the glass, and handed it to Lily. "Well, how timely that you appear to refill my glass." They continued eyeing each other. "You caused quite the stir, you know. The help, participating in a conversation. Is that the way things are done here in Appalachia?" The girl kept her face still, unafraid. Lily had to give her that. Lily leaned closer. The truth is, I enjoyed seeing Grant caught with his hands in the phylacteries, so to speak. Carrie! Grant's voice echoed off the gymnasium's stone walls. With a tilt of her head, Lily acknowledged the look in the maid's eyes, strode to the door of the pool, and called across the corridor to the gym. "Why, Mr. Grant, were you looking for someone?" "Ah!" He stopped, flustered, as he approached the door of the pool room. "Miss Barthélemy, what a surprise." "I'll bet." Grant's eyes traveled from Lily to the maid he'd spotted now, her back still against the wall. The maid was blushing a fuchsia that clashed with her hair, but her eyes were striking, defiant. Perhaps Lily had given her too little credit before. "So then, Mr. Grant," Lily arched an eyebrow. The arch of that very brow had yanked men far more powerful than this pathetic New York attorney back into line. She was from New Orleans, and she was French, two very good reasons not to be much startled by a man flirting with a pretty housemaid at a friend's vacation estate. Still, she was unaccustomed to stumbling directly upon it herself, perhaps because the men in her orbit typically orbited her. Grant offered a smile gleaming with polish and calm and money. "Miss Barthélemy, I must tell you how refreshing it is in an era of mannish cycling clothing and walking skirts to see a lady dressed so elegantly for dinner, and then even for bowling." Reflexively, though she saw his game, she smoothed her skirt. To breakfast, she'd worn a wonder of tiered lace, a gown designed to turn heads, though with a modest neckline. Tonight's gown, by contrast, had not had a modest neckline. She meant to make the most of her time with George Vanderbilt. "Our host," Grant added, "is a more complex man than most, is he not?" In answer, Lily steepled the other brow. "He'll require a wife who'd rather read by the fire in a remote corner of the Blue Ridge than waltz until dawn to the Blue Danube, wouldn't you say?" The maid took a silent step toward the door, but Grant's hand shot out for her arm. "Monsieur," Lily said, "one may not always grab what one wants." Straightening one lapel, Grant cleared his throat, then plucked a telegram from his jacket pocket, which he held out to the maid. "The man Ling delivered it earlier, though I'd forgotten about it, I confess, until this moment." The maid lifted her head. "Rather like the phylacteries?" Lily laughed. Taking the telegram from him, the maid's curiosity, or, from her expression, her dread, appeared to get the better of her. She tore the telegram open. Casually, Lily glanced over her shoulder to read. "Your scholarship about to be reassigned. Can you assure trustees of your return to New York?" Crunching the telegram in one fist, she fled down the hall, still clutching the bottle of port. Madison Grant's eyes followed her. Lily waited until he'd returned. "One petite memory from my childhood, Mr. Grant. As a girl, I once stood on my father's wharf in New Orleans and watched a shark circle a wounded fish just thrown back into the sea. I recall, Mr. Grant, wanting to jump off the wharf to save the poor fish, small as it was." For a full moment, neither one of them spoke or moved. "Interesting," he finally observed, "that the police have not yet suspected your connection with Aaron Berkowitz." Lily's pulse dropped to the faintest thrum. Grant knew. She could see the dare in his eyes, the triumph. Lily could not breathe. "I've no idea, Mr. Grant, what you mean." Really, Miss Barthélemy, because a friend of mine in New York who does legal work for the Times responded to a letter of mine. He tells me reporters had been sent to New Orleans and Asheville both to talk with a certain Louisiana businessman about whom they had new and quite interesting information. If I know this, I suspect someone among the police does too by now. Don't you? Chapter 44. Lily watched Emily smile at John Cabot from beneath her lashes, frosted prettily with ice pellets on this misty late winter day. Biltmore's Deer Park, gone a honeyed brown, crunched under their horses' hooves. But the profile of his face that Cabot turned away from poor Emily was less warm than one of the men in the friezes over the banquet hall fireplaces. Lily nudged her own mount closer. Cheer up, chérie. He has a fine face, I'll grant you, but with no suitable income attached. Emily sighed. If only I could make myself flirt with a suitable income attached to a pudding face. Oh, well. She patted the gelding she rode. At least the grooms matched me with a sweetheart of a horse today. Lily grimaced. Rather a plodder, though. Only to those who do not plod well. Ah, c'est vrai, fair enough. I did notice that the stable hand who's disappeared, she cut her eyes toward Lily, had learned a great deal about your particular preferences. Lily waited, her face giving away nothing. Emily could not possibly know how many times Lily had lingered in the stables last fall to talk with the Italian, unless the servants had talked. What sort of horse I mean to saddle for you? But Emily's face said more. Lily glanced away. He did tend to saddle the most high-strung of George's hunters for me. Yes, he must have sensed that in you, that you relished a good risk. Lily gave a laugh that sounded false even to her. That, or he was trying to help me break my own neck. She shielded her eyes from the sun with her hand. Where's that uncle of yours, I wonder? Lils. Lily turned in her side saddle, her right knee raised nearly to the mare's neck now. Lils, surely it's a good thing the Italian has disappeared. For your sake, I mean. No, you needn't respond. Just answer me this. Do you find my uncle intriguing? Honestly. Lily slowed to choose her words carefully. Your Uncle Georges possesses something I've rarely found in men of our class. Yes? An overarching kindness. Emily beamed. Why, yes, that's so true. The other truth was, Lily thought, it bewildered her, and all that kindness bored her a little too, the complete consistency, the utter predictability of it. But surely kindness in a man was the sort of thing one could learn to live with. You know, don't you, Lils, what people are saying? Lily stiffened. About New Orleans? I meant about George's inviting you back to Biltmore. The society pages are crackling with anticipation over a forthcoming announcement. Lily lowered her eyes. Sweet, loyal Emily. She deserved a humble reply. Kind, trusting George. He deserved gratitude. Lily looked up and managed a smile for her friend. The society pages would appear to know more about my life than I do. Trotting up to join them, Cabot swung down from his mount. Remarkably fine horses Vanderbilt keeps. Doesn't he, though? Lily squinted toward the base of the next hill. I suppose that's the forestry crew gathered there by the river. Cabot gestured with a bob of his head. Black and white men together, working side by side as one crew. You don't see that too often down here. Or in New York ever, Emily pointed out. A chill ran down Lily's arms. The burly Dirk Tate, off to one side in the farthest cluster of white men, sat staring at her. She'd heard somewhere that he no longer worked for Biltmore and had finally sold George his farm. Yet here he was, on the estate. Leading his horse up to the three of them, Grant ran a hand across his jaw. "That man appears to be looking at you, Miss Barthélemy, rather intently." Given what she'd seen near the gym of Grant pursuing the maid, he wouldn't dare expose Lily in front of the others. She tilted her head at him. "Is a man staring at me so very hard to understand?" "Ah, you make a splendid point." She was desperate to change the subject. "Mr. Cabot, you are awfully quiet today. I wonder if your in-depth study of the mountain people has you distracted." "No doubt," he said, and looked back at her impassively. "Carrie McGregor, in particular, must prove a challenging case. Part refined lady, part tanner of hides and slopper of hogs, part scullery maid, part wildcat." Emily sucked a breath in. "Really, Lils?" "I agree," Cabot said at last. "She is indeed a young woman of many gifts." George Vanderbilt was cantering now up the hill. "Perhaps," Lily murmured to Emily, "I might entice Georges away from the group, temporarily only, of course." "And risk his feeling pursued?" Emily looked skeptical. "The real art of the thing, of course, is convincing the fox that he's really the hound." Lily urged her mare into a gallop. Reaching George, she reined in her horse. "You'll be glad to know we delayed all scintillating conversation till your arrival." He smiled, those good, friendly brown eyes, much like his St. Bernard's, really. "Forgive my delay in coming. I was attending to business at the stables. We're a bit short-handed." She'd not meant to broach the subject, but then she'd not expected him to mention the stables. The question shot out of her mouth. "I wonder about where that Italian, your stable hand, has gone." "Of course, Bergamini." Lily heard the hesitation, as if George knew for certain that wasn't his name. Salvatore, Lily thought, hearing the name in her head that he'd confided to her. Confided, and then looked the next instant for only a flash, but she'd seen it nevertheless, as if he wondered if he could trust her fully. She could feel the rough of his cheek against hers as she'd whispered his name the last time she'd been alone with him, his hand at the small of her back. That last time they were together was the first time he'd not kept his arms full of tack and hay bales. Even that had only been moments. George's brow furrowed, a screen of apprehension dropping over his face. Being from New Orleans, you would naturally be concerned about him. She could see he mostly believed that was true, that her motives were pure as the frost that tipped the fields that morning. That even if he'd caught a glance exchanged between her and Sal, he would have already convinced himself he'd been only imagining things. Mostly. Yes, we are a loyal lot from New Orleans." With pressure from her left leg, she turned her mare so George could no longer see her face. She'd overstepped. Time now to change course. "I wonder which of these two hunters we're riding is more fleet of foot." "Well," he began, "and I wonder how we might prove it." Snapping back her head to smile at him, she shifted her weight forward in the side saddle and gripped the upper pommel with her right leg. She and the mare shot away from him. Glancing back, she saw George posting in a half circle, unsure. Another glance, and he was urging his own horse to full speed in pursuit. Lily bent low over her horse and aimed the mare's head toward a split-rail fence she hoped, but was not entirely sure, they both could clear. It was George Vanderbilt who was chasing her now, quite literally. Her pulse dropped as she neared the fence, its crisscrossed rails like big wooden stitches across the field. Lily felt the mare gather her body, the power centralized in her back legs as she launched. Up and up. That moment when they were no longer tethered to earth, no longer subject to its laws and constraints. That moment when it remained to be seen how they would land. which, if John Cabot and his Kodak had been poised to photograph this moment, would be the perfect image for her life right now. Impeccably dressed and well strategized, graceful and soaring. And, depending on what secrets came to light, perhaps about to land in a shattered heap. Absorbing the jolt of the mare's front legs as they made contact again with the ground, Lily glanced back only once more and found George Vanderbilt close at her heels. How odd, though, that it wasn't George's kind face she saw as she rode. Instead, it was the Italian's. Her thoughts churned with each stride of her mare, a storm of self-interest and compassion, and, God help her, desire. Keeping her skirts clear of the sizzling pots and mounded pastries in the kitchens, Lily kept her strides light and carefree, but not without authority. "Hello, Mrs. Smythe." "Why, Miss Barthélemy." The housekeeper's voice betrayed what Lily knew full well. It wasn't her place to be here downstairs. She was not mistress of Biltmore. Not yet. Still, a guest of George's couldn't be corrected by the housekeeper, especially since the servants probably knew better than anyone else that their employer was quite possibly smitten with the heiress from New Orleans. Heiress. That sounded a great deal better than what also might be whispered below stairs. How, for instance, she'd been seen talking animatedly and at length on several occasions with the Italian inside the stables, or how, the servants might have caught wind, she came from some sort of bloody past in New Orleans, or how, the servants might whisper, she was connected somehow with a death at the station. Lily gave herself a hard shake. She was growing suspicious and fearful, neither of which was like her. "I was just popping downstairs to see if I might find that maid. What was her name? Carrie, I believe." Mrs. Smythe cocked her head. "She's only in the next room scouring pans, is our Carrie, but I do hate to see you have that lovely silk broom down here." From the pastry area came the rumbles of a man's voice with a heavy French accent and a woman's with a thick mountain twang. "Zut! I tell you once, I tell you 1,000 times. The meringue, it must be whipped until it stands up stiff as the tower." "I hadn't got issue with your meringue till I saw it slump down and roll to its back like a possum trying to hide itself from the hunt." Mrs. Smythe cringed. "Beg forgiveness for our kitchen staff. There have been a few differences we've yet to smooth out." Of course. Lily took this as her chance to sweep past the housekeeper. "I wouldn't dream of mentioning the unrest below stairs to Mr. Vanderbilt, particularly as you have the rest of the house so beautifully in hand, Mrs. Smythe." The pacified Mrs. Smythe, Lily was relieved to see, did not follow her into the next kitchen, but rather withdrew to the pastry area where the two battling voices grew hotter. The maid, Carrie, straightened at the sink, her red hair corkscrewing at her temples. Lily could see that, from the set of the maid's jaw, she already guessed what had brought a house guest down here. Diamonds glinting incongruously, no doubt, in this fog of boiling water and steam. The Italian. Lily blurted it out before she had time to arrange her words like playing cards in a game of whist. She regretted her haste, but there it was. "Mr. Bergamini and his brother, I'm wondering if they are safe." The maid turned from the sink, wiping those chapped hands on her skirt. She appeared to be studying Lily's face, waiting. Lily recoiled at the thought of what her face might be revealing. It could make her vulnerable to the maid, even more than she already was, since this Carrie McGregor had seen handwriting she recognized in the letter from Tate. Despite the set of Lily's shoulders, always regal, and the arch of her eyebrow that gave warning, Lily suspected the maid could see she was nervous. The maid, Carrie, gave a slow blink that seemed to say she was choosing not to say what she was thinking. Lily met the maid's eye, the knowing there, the things this maid might be suspecting. Lily's trill of a laugh came an instant too late, and an octave too forced. "It's ridiculous, of course, my even bothering, but I was concerned when they so suddenly disappeared." Silence. The maid taking her measure, Lily thought with growing unease. Then finally, "They are for the moment safe. How long that will be true, I couldn't say." Lily had more she wanted to ask, though it might show more of her hand. A squawk came from the pastry area, where the two voices had battled over meringue. "He ain't never!" the mountain woman was shouting. "I won't believe it was him gone and done it. I won't. And that poor little brother of his. What's become?" Footsteps clattered across the tile floors. Lily and the maid both turned as the older red-headed woman, the cook with a face the color of escargot, burst over the threshold and, ignoring Lily entirely, demanded of the maid, "Carrie, you got to find out if it's true. That footman Moncrief just come from upstairs saying that awful man with the look of a bloodhound to him, all jowly." The maid's eyes went round. "LeBlanc? He's back again," Moncrief said. "Not at the house. Somewheres on the estate." Chapter 45. Carrie moved through that evening in a haze, the dinner at Biltmore passing in what felt like time slowed to nearly a stop. Walking past the clock in the servants' dining room, she was surprised to see its pendulum swinging, like some sort of prank someone was playing. Time was still moving on. Just this very evening, as a cello sang back in the tapestry gallery and Sterling tapped against Sterling, she'd let herself think that life at Biltmore had become almost steady. It was still foreign to her, too walled in with marble and glass, but with its own rhythms now, the swishing of silk, the clinking of crystal, the scuffling of maids in the back halls. "Blimey," Mrs. Smythe said when Carrie bumped again into a wall. "Don't tell me you're bevied up now." "Not drunk," Carrie assured her. "Just clumsy." Carrie could not tell her the truth, that her mind was with the Italians in the dairy barn, and her not even able to warn them, for fear LeBlanc, watching everyone's moves, would only follow her there. Just after serving the cognac and coffee, Carrie slipped out the porte-cochere doors just to breathe, the night air full of the scent of melting snow and thawing earth. Like everyone else at the estate, everyone else in these mountains, she'd been haunted by questions since autumn, the wondering whose laugh could be trusted, whose smile was only a cover, a rattler in its old skin. Maybe LeBlanc coming onto the estate had been nothing but hearsay. Maybe, just like the Pellegrini, completed at last on the library ceiling, they were finally free of the dark and moving toward light, toward the truth of what happened last fall. She'd felt it this morning, that brighter tone, the chuckling from the men at one end of the hall, the crackle of the hearth logs, the low babble of voices like a brook over rocks. She felt it on the staircase earlier, that brighter mood, the women's heels tapping out time on the steps, the cantilevered stone seeming to float 4 stories up. "Carrie," John Cabot whispered as she'd swept past, "we need to talk. It's urgent." His voice, tight as a singing bow's thread, backed this up. Pausing, she'd let her head shift just a notch and given the hint of a nod, enough that he would have seen it, enough that others might have as well. That was a risk she might regret. Lily Barthélemy had brushed past, watching pointedly. Raising her chin, Carrie had met her gaze. But now, if only for these few stolen moments, Carrie was alone, where she could gather herself and brace for whatever it was John Cabot considered urgent. Just her and her mountains. The earth smelled of unfurling fiddlehead ferns and bloodroot and all manner of mosses. A mist had settled like a fine silk over the front esplanade, wound up the house's main turret, and snagged on its spires. In the electric light blazing through Biltmore's windows, the world shimmered. Her attention swung to the dark outline of the gazebo high on the hill, rising at the far end of the lawn. Had it only been a few months ago when she'd stood up there at its edge on a day much like this, the fog and the riffling blue of the ridge all around? Just a few months and a lifetime ago. From inside came more strains of the string quartet brought down this week from New York. The cello led the way through another slow, swirling waltz. Suddenly, the towering doors behind her swung open. Footsteps across the stone, sharp and loud, because he was tall and the heel taps of his shoes weren't soft by years moving over wet ground, like hers were. A pause punctuated each step, like he was asking permission to join her. Turning, she met Cabot's gaze. He had followed her out, waiting just long enough so it might not be clear to the others what he was doing. Even so, there would be those who would guess. He took one more step from behind. She crossed her arms still tighter over her chest. I need to know who I can trust. We all do. His voice came low, barely audible over the string quartet and a chorus of wood frogs, fervent and loud, who'd made their home in the garden pools just below. They thaw themselves out from a deep freeze, those wood frogs do, she said, and they start sometimes when there's still snow in the groves and up on the peaks, just calling like that. Calling? For what? She didn't answer. Surely even in Boston, creatures called that desperately to each other for only one reason. Carrie, there's some news. He stepped to where he could see her face. And before I tell you, I need you to know. He reached out as if he would touch the line of her jaw, but held back. I'm on your side. She heard the loyalty there in his voice, quiet but fierce. But she could not meet his eyes, not yet, because he would not understand the turmoil in her they raised. Your side. Living in two worlds, as she did now, she'd become like the rag doll she'd made for Tully, the one left by the hearth. Her father's two hounds, including Mercutio, who died years ago, had discovered the doll at the same time, one cloth hand in each set of teeth. These days, that's what she'd become, seams ripping. My side? She wanted to ask. What side would that be? Instead, she kept her arms crossed, but lifted her face. Here, all around, were the mountains, life about to burst out again in a wet, giddy green. And here he was, part of the throb and the thrum and the new, part of the questions, part of the seam-ripping pull. Carrie, I need you to know also. He seemed to be waiting for her. She turned. I knew Aaron Berkowitz before that day at the station. Yes, she said. To say I saw it on your faces that day was no help now, although you didn't volunteer that at the time, which has made me wonder if you could be trusted. Call it cowardice, call it being ashamed of the past. Both would be fair. He drew a breath. While we were at Harvard, our interests aligned not only on the classics and political affairs, but also... You were in love, her voice had gone husky, with the same woman. He was in love, I believe, with a girl from an old family on Brattle Street in Cambridge, but it was nothing so noble as that on my part. He waited to go on until Carrie raised her eyes again to his. I've told you I was reckless and angry in the months after my family was killed. I pursued her, this woman he loved, only because, perhaps, I liked the feeling of power, being able to shift her attention to myself. I had no real interest in her, which was cruel. Yes, to her and to him. I was numb, I think, during that time, prone to smashing things up just to see if I could make myself feel something, anything. I probably did the young lady no permanent harm. After I quit calling on her, she recovered, married another classmate of ours. But I destroyed Berkowitz's trust in her and in me, whatever future they might have had. He sighed. I should have offered this to the police right away, but I've been ashamed by the whole affair, my own handling of it. Then, after I waited so long to speak up, I was afraid I might seem untrustworthy. Yes, you did. I didn't think that one omission mattered much at the time, but now I'm headed to the jail to point out other suspects the police have overlooked, including me. The call of the tree frogs thrumming in her head, Carrie pictured the brothers huddled under the hay. She turned in the direction of the dairy barn, as if she could see past Biltmore House itself and the acres of deer park and pastures and woods. Carrie, there's something else urgent I need to say. LeBlanc seems to have gotten a tip on where the Bergaminis were hiding. She spun back toward him. No. Did they? They were found, Carrie. They've been arrested. Chapter 46. Sal gripped the bars of his cell, one hand around his brother's shoulders, which were trembling. Nico pressed closer, as if the strength he felt in his brother could be passed through damp skin and dripping clothes. Sal reached for the thin blanket flopped on the cot, wrapped it snugly around Nico. We must keep you warm. His mother's words echoed in the silence of concrete and cold. I beg you, my son, protect our little Nico. I'm trying, Sal said into the quiet. I won't give up trying. In a driving rain, LeBlanc had arrived at the dairy barn with Wolf. Through the cracks in the planks, Sal had seen LeBlanc turn up the collar of his black coat. Best come on out, Wolf had called. Can't say I'd relish hurting a kid. LeBlanc had made a show of aiming his revolver up toward the dairy barn's loft. Nothing but a dago, not much of a loss. The steady thrum of his fear for Nico that always lived in his chest had swelled to a roar. Now at the jail, Sal was no longer seeing Wolf a few feet away, but a much older man, steely eyes, hunched behind a mahogany desk, as if its bulk reflected his personal strength. How do I know, Maurice Barthélemy had demanded of him that day 4 years ago, that you're not Hennessy's murderer? How do I know it wasn't you our valiant chief saw in that alley where he was shot? How do I know you weren't the dago he mentioned with his final breath? Sal could have told him it had in fact been his own face, and Frank Cernoya's, that Hennessy saw there in the alley. But Sal had skipped to what mattered most. My brother, he is lost. Last night, the riot. The man lit a cigar. You dagos can't even trust each other. All these years later, Sal could still feel the seething that made his whole body throb. My brother is very young. And afraid. The man chewed on the end of his cigar. Comme c'est triste, as we say in my family. How very sad. The man's tone dripped in sarcasm. From behind Sal, the office door slammed then, the heavy tread of one of the man's thugs approaching. Mr. Barthélemy, I was told this guy here needed removing. Indeed, LeBlanc. This Guinea here appears to be under the impression that I, of all people, might somehow be responsible for the regrettable unrest last night in our fair city. He swigged from his scotch. Can you imagine? Barthélemy laughed hoarsely, as if the scotch or his own words had shriveled his throat. Sal had said no such thing, and until that moment had not even thought it. He'd only come here to a man who owned much of the wharves because he'd hoped for his help finding Nico. And now, suddenly, here in this jail cell, Blocks of thought moved in Sal's mind, arranging themselves into a picture like the sections of the painting being pieced together at Biltmore on the library ceiling. Only instead of a bare arm extending to share the lamp of knowledge, here before Sal was the image of this man's arm in its glossy white shirt sleeve, its cufflinks of pearl, as he motioned to his thug Leblanc. Catalfamo here was just leaving. Jerking away, Sal had stalked to the door and turned. This country does not have the kings. Barthélemy's upper lip had buckled into a sneer. You Guinea trash don't know when you're beat. Sal had planted his feet. My brother Nico, I will not leave without finding him. Comme c'est triste. A shame. Mobs have a way of being no respecter of persons, including little dagos. I can't answer for the mood of the mob this morning. I'd lay money, though, since you've been one of the ones on trial, Catalfamo, that they'll recognize your face. Rage lit Sal from the inside as more pieces shifted into place now. Through Sal's mind flashed the memory of the alley. Cernoia and him sent there as envoys to talk with Hennessy. Not to threaten exactly, and certainly not to kill. Sal had not even been armed, and Cernoia carried only a knife in case they were jumped. They'd come to remind Hennessy that the Italians of New Orleans would not allow themselves to be divided into warring families, that they demanded fair treatment. And then the shot from behind all three of them, just as Sal and Cernoia approached the chief, his back toward them. Hennessy whirling to see two Italians standing there gaping, horrified. Sal had bent over the chief, seen where the shot had entered, and known the chief would not live but moments longer, heard running footsteps out on the street, someone calling the chief's name. Conveniently, searching for him seconds after he'd been shot, someone who would serve as witness to what wasn't the truth. Sal and Cernoia had fled toward the opposite end of the alley, but they'd been spotted as they clambered over the brick wall, and even without that, Sal had realized, the Italians of New Orleans would be blamed. A frenzied rounding up of suspects had followed, the shouted repetition of Hennessy's supposed final word, Dagos. Hatred swelled in the city toward its Sicilians. 19 Italian men rounded up, the court trial, the lack of hard evidence, the dismissal of charges, the mob gathering to bring justice itself, the breaking into the jail, the cries, "We want the Dagos!" Italians riddled with bullets and strung up like so many sides of beef in the market. 8 men escaped. And now, here in this dank Carolina cell with its icy stone floor, the story finally made sense. It was Barthélemy, Sal said to Nico, though his brother was curled in a fitful sleep. He ordered Hennessy's murder. He knew who would be blamed, and that would give to him control of the wharves. Barthélemy must have seen in Sal's face that understanding was dawning even then. Barthélemy's eyes had become slits. This garlic eater, he told Leblanc evenly, has taken enough of our time. And breathed enough air was never voiced, but crackled there in the room. Leblanc's hand resting on the hilt of a pistol punctuated his boss's command. Bursting out of Barthélemy's office, Sal dropped down the steps 4 at a time, bullets whizzing over his head. As his feet hit the boards of the wharves, he dodged shadow to shadow. The bodyguard fired again, the bullet grazing one ear. Sal lost him at last near the Café du Monde, where he hid until nightfall in a storeroom bursting with chicory and coffee and pulverized sugar. After dusk, as the cafe brightened to gold and laughter hung in the air with clouds of suspended sugar, Sal slipped through the crowd back to what they called Little Palermo. He ran up staircases, ducked into alleyways, asking anyone he could find, A little boy caught in the riots. My brother Nico is lost. Have you seen him?" But doors were locked. People huddled inside, hiding from the mobs that still roamed the streets like rabid dogs. Finally, an old woman, hunched like a shepherd's crook, opened her tenement door just a crack, then more fully at Sal's description. "An old woman, she is the most fragile in any crowd, and the most brave. What can a mob do to me? End my life when I'm already so close? Make me afraid when I've already seen hunger and death? I hoped I could stop them, that mob." She shook her head. "It was John Parker who got the mob shouting, lifting their fists, dragging our men, innocent men, through the streets. I was knocked down. They stampeded this mob. See, yes, and the boy. I saw a boy crying, calling out, 'Mio fratello,' trampled, his leg badly hurt. Another man, one of us, picked up the child and ran toward the rail yards." The old woman pulled Sal's face down toward her so close their foreheads touched. "Dio ti benedica. God bless you in your search." Covered in coal ash, Sal searched car to car for hours. He finally found his brother huddled behind crates of rum and Madeira with Sonoya, who would stow away the next day in search of stone-cutting work. Much later, Sal would hear through another Sicilian in the quarries with him that Sonoya had gone to an estate in North Carolina that was hiring Italians for its limestone exterior. An estate with a vast house that Sal had not realized until then really existed beyond memory and dreams and an espresso-stained page. Sal's own Pellegrini had formed the full picture. Why a man of power and wealth had never given up on his search for the nobody Salvatore Catalfamo, because Sal had pieced together just who was behind the killing of Chief Hennessy. Whether or not anyone would believe a penniless Sicilian was a question Barthélemy apparently had never been willing to leave to chance. More powerful men than the Napoleon of New Orleans, after all, had been toppled by less. Even as Sal and Nico had stowed away in a train car headed north, Sal had seen the face behind the lynchings, not so much John Parker, the mouthpiece of the riots who'd riled and rallied the mob, as Maurice Barthélemy himself, overseer of the tide of imports and exports that enriched the seaport's salty lifeblood. Barthélemy, whose greatest competitors there were the two powerful Italian families, the Provenzanos and the Matrangas, who'd battled for their own control of the wharves. A man who stood to benefit more than any other if suddenly New Orleans despised and distrusted its Italian population. Barthélemy, who would now dominate the waterfront if no one suspected him. If Salvatore Catalfamo and anyone else who might point a finger at him could be found and silenced. Maurice Barthélemy, whose daughter Sal could have taken revenge on. He'd lain awake thinking of this when she'd been only a name, only the idea of a daughter of the man behind so much death. He'd wanted to hate her as he did her father. The daughter's flirtations had probably been only a wild and dangerous gambit meant to distract and manipulate Sal, at first. But they'd quickly become something else for them both. A deadly pull, a kind of quicksand. A key clanged in the lock of the cell. Nico pressed hard into his side, and Sal's arm went more tightly around his brother as Wolf shambled into the small space. His face, twitching and tense, was at odds with the casual way he was trying to walk. Wolf jerked his head down toward Nico. "Group of townspeople out there fussing how it ain't right to hold a kid in jail, so I'll be taking the boy now." "No." Sal wrapped both arms around Nico. The boy buried his face in Sal's chest. "Relax, we'll get him housed somewhere. We will not let you do this." From outside the cell door, LeBlanc appeared, smirking. "Good thing I hadn't left town yet. I always like to be of service, even after I snag my man." He leveled his revolver at Sal's nose. "It's not some 8-year-old kid I'll be hauling back to New Orleans for a trial, assuming they don't want you here for murder charges at the same time. It's you, Catalfamo, just you." Ignoring LeBlanc, Sal appealed to Wolf. "I beg you, my brother will not feel safe. Nico is used to me only." Wolf reached to cinch Nico around the waist and pulled. Sal's arms stronger than Wolf's, he held tight to Nico. "Please listen, please. My brother, he cannot walk right. He needs the help. Do not separate us." Nico reached for Sal's face. "Ti amo." LeBlanc sprang forward, punching Sal in the jaw. Hunched sideways in pain, Sal clung to his brother. "Without me, he will not eat. Please." LeBlanc raised his revolver again, aimed this time at Nico's head. Sal saw Nico's face turn toward the gun's muzzle, his body suddenly gone still. His eyes held steady on Sal's. "Mi fido di te," he whispered. "I trust you." "Best let go of the kid," LeBlanc spat, "or my next bullet'll be to his head." Chapter 47. Anguished, Carrie stood over her father's bed. From the other side of the tick, Tully and Jersey watched her to gauge how they should feel. But Carrie herself could feel nothing, except the sharp, torn edges around the hole where she ought to feel grief. She should be in town at the jail to help the Catalfamos. She could picture little Nico, shivering, his frame already more bones than flesh, curled up on the cold floor. Or she should be up at Barnard, her English lit professor expounding on the romantic poets and their excess of emotion, Carrie writing down every word, thinking how she came from people who let loose their sorrow and rage and desire only in lyrics, and the keening draw of a bow over strings. But here she stood instead, keeping watch over this man as he lay unconscious, a small moan every few moments, the father who'd wrung her mother dry, the turmoil he'd wreaked. Carrie lifted her gaze from his face, gray and drawn, to the twins. Their eyes were a mirrored reflection, two sets of rounded blue pain. "You said when you came to get me that you saw a change in him?" "He'd got better," Tully said, "sitting up, even spoke enough to wheeze out, 'Get your sister.'" "Tossin'," Jersey echoed, "like to stand up all by hisself." Carrie reached a hand to both of them across the bed. "I believe you. The final—" She stopped herself there. After all, she couldn't be sure. "The stages of a sickness can be odd. You were right to come get me." The snap of twigs and a low rumble of voices from somewhere outside made them all spin toward the door. With no windows in the barn, Carrie hurried to its entrance to see who was approaching. From behind her, Romeo growled, brown hackles raised. Carrie slipped a hand to her right boot. There, the knife. Jersey joined her at the door, his legs already spread out in the best mountain man stance a 13-year-old could manage. He glanced down at her hand. "You always could gig a trout in the gills from a good dozen foot back." It was an exaggeration, but they both took a moment's comfort in it. More snapping of twigs from just below the ridge where the path dropped straight down toward the falls, the low nicker of a horse, and then the muffled sobbings of a child. Carrie exchanged looks with her brother. Tully joined them, wide-eyed and braced, at the barn door. At the crest of the path, Robert Bratchett appeared on his ancient horse, and huddled on the same horse just in front of him, little Nico. The hand of Bratchett's immobilized left arm rested tenderly on the child's shoulder as Nico curled in tighter and cried. But most astounding of all was Bratchett swinging down from the horse, easing the child off after him, carrying him on his shoulders and steadied with his one good arm through the barn doors. Nodding to the three young McGregors, he didn't stop until he reached their father's makeshift bed. Johnny McGregor's eyes blinked open. He lay conscious for the first time since Carrie arrived, breathless from Biltmore, as if the sheer force of Bratchett's presence now, and whatever past they had shared, had ripped the clouds from the dying man's mind, and not gently. "Johnny Mac," Bratchett said. The voice seemed to open some sort of secret door. Carrie watched, astonished, as her father's eyes filled with tears, and he lifted his right hand an inch or two above the tick. "Bobby Bratch," he rasped. Little Nico sat gently on the floor. Bratchett dropped his good arm to grasp the hand lifted, just barely, to him. "We need a place to hide this boy, Johnny. Ella and me, we can bring food, but you know better'n anyone. We're no kind of safe place." Something passed between the two men, Carrie saw. Johnny Mac squeezed shut his eyes as if there were something he'd rather not see. "I do know," he said. "I figure," Bratchett went on, "you owe not only me, but also the world in general a favor." "Yes," was all Johnny Mac said, voice crumbling to nothing but dust. And yet he managed the same word again. "Yes." Chapter 48. Carrie spent several hours getting Nico set with the twins, who made him a pallet beside their own near Malvolio's stall, and showed him where to pet the mule on the soft of his muzzle so that he'd flicker his eyes. She spooned wild peppermint tea and creamed corn down her father's throat. Carrie held up the photograph for him, and gently, more gently than she had since she'd come home, cradled his head to let him see better. He smiled, a strange, distant smile. "Bobby Bratch," he whispered, then gave in to the weight of his head falling back. Exhausted, Carrie slipped through the woods back to Biltmore the next morning. All she could see as she walked was Madison Grant, his suits perfectly pressed, hair perfectly smoothed. Somehow, surely, he was behind all this, the attack at the station, the blaming of innocent men, the child ripped from his brother and huddled now in her barn. Not sure what she'd do or how, Carrie checked in first with the cooks. Rima stood in front of row upon row of glass mason jars filled with spears of green. "I declare I can like a man who grows a good okra." Carrie didn't point out that Vanderbilt didn't weed his own fields or preserve his own produce, but only nodded absently and slipped upstairs, tracked the sound of Grant's voice to the billiard room, the clack of the balls, the scent of cigar smoke emanating into the hall, which meant she had at least a few moments to slip upstairs to his guest room. Carrie had no evidence of Grant's part in the train station attack, only a sense deep in her gut. Maybe if she'd been able to track him like she'd hunted wild boar, or been allowed to pummel him with questions, as the police should have. But that wasn't an option for a kitchen maid supposed to be roasting potatoes right now. Swiftly she walked, never breaking into a run, which would attract attention, back toward the servants' staircase, finished at last. Climbing to the second story of the bachelor's wing, she looked both ways down the corridor. A kitchen maid shouldn't have been there for any number of reasons, but she would hurry. She would not be found. Every Biltmore guest room had a brass fitting on its door for the current occupant's calling card, so the room Carrie was searching for took only moments to find. Grant had left his coat strewn over a chair near the fireplace, a patterned tweed. Heart-pounding, Carrie checked its pockets one by one. Nothing but an old train ticket to Best, a receipt from Beaumarchais, and a scrap of paper scrawled with words she couldn't make out. Carrie scanned the room. Nothing else out of place. A stack of letterhead stationery left on a small table. Approaching, Carrie flipped through. all the pages embossed with a Vanderbilt crest, but otherwise blank. Except the top one bore the imprint of what someone had penned on the page above it. Carrie held it up to the light filtering in from the far window. The letter F she could make out. No salutation, just a word beginning with F. Footsteps echoed outside on the marble. Heart hammering, she squinted at the imprinted lines. F. Family? No. Femme. Work? The footsteps stopped in front of the guest room door, the metal click of a hand turning the knob. Or a name, perhaps, like Farnsworth. Someone else here Grant is influencing, another of the pieces in the LNA puzzle. Carrie crumpled the page, thrust it deep in her apron pocket just as the door swung open. Madison Grant smoothed his face into a flat, mirthless smile. Carrie, how interesting to find you here in the bachelor's wing. I was under the distinct impression only valets and footmen assist the male guests. Perhaps the rules have changed to my advantage. They stood sizing each other up. Then one of his hands shot back to flip a lever on the door's knob, locking it. He kicked it shut behind him, strode forward. She felt the breath leave her. As she stood her ground, he stepped in close. Stealing a glance at the stack of stationery, his features relaxed. Reassured, perhaps, that he'd not left the letter there. Stepping back, Carrie could feel the fireplace mantle against her shoulder blades. Nowhere to run. He wasn't a muscular man, but he was a man with much to lose. And desperate men, like cornered boars, were ferocious. She gripped the back of the chair with his tweed coat strewn across it, the coat he'd worn the day she'd applied at the Battery Park Inn for work. An image flashed across her mind. Grant in the tweed coat in the inn, the clerk calling across the lobby. So good to have you back again this season, Mr. Grant. You were here before last fall, she said. Last fall wasn't your first visit to Asheville. You've been here before, spreading your putrid, hateful ideas. A place where the rich have been coming since the railroad arrived, so no one thought a thing of your being here, doing your work among people you knew to be angry and scared with all the change, just looking for someone to blame. The smile did not wane, even as he pushed her against the wall next to the fireplace. Now he pressed his groin against her so hard her spine crushed against the wall. I've no idea, he said in her ear, what you mean. Turning inside, she eased her right leg up as she reached down toward her calf. His hands moved on her, but she couldn't fight him. Not yet. He kissed her neck as if he would bite down on her throat, feral, going in for the kill, then shake his head so hard her spine snapped. Carrie had slipped her hand under her skirt's hem. Her fingers could just brush the knife's handle now. Just another inch. If he could just be distracted, even for an instant, she could reach farther down and get to it. Her voice came strained from her crushed chest. You're behind all of it. The flyers promoting hate, the group in France, and the people here you've been in contact with, the fear you've tried to fan. He eased back an inch, eyes sparkling with triumph, a hunter with a deer in the crosshairs. Slowly, taking advantage of his leaning slightly back, she managed to lift her leg enough to slide the knife up out of the top of her boot with 2 fingers. So, she managed, did you kill Berkowitz yourself, or hire Farnsworth to do it? His lips stretched into a sneer. So, you've landed on me as the killer, have you? She wasn't at all sure she'd hit on the answer, Grant killing the man out of sheer loathing or a fear of what the reporter might have known that could have sullied Grant's public reputation. For all his superiority and polish, Madison Grant seemed capable of attacking someone he loathed, just like he'd smashed the phylacteries. and she had to see his reaction. Her hand wrapped fully around the knife now. Did he have particularly damning information on you and the LNA? Something perhaps that could have hurt your public persona, if the public knew what an utter scoundrel you are? She began easing her right hand up. One of his eyebrows lifted. And what, pray tell, does a little kitchen maid know of the LNA? Her right hand was nearly in position for a clear strike, but then he pinioned both arms to her sides. No one, you understand, will believe a pretty little servant, dirt poor, over an Ivy League man from a prominent family of New York. Try it, and I promise I will ruin you. He thrust himself hard up against her again, and her spine slammed into the wall once more. The impact loosened her grip on the knife, and it slipped soundlessly to the room's carpet. Oblivious of what she'd just dropped, Grant yanked upward on her skirts and grabbed under them. Carrie ducked away from him even as she strained toward the knife he'd not seen. But Grant wrenched her back. You little slut. Just as he'd bragged in the bowling alley, Grant did know his angles. Clamping down at her wrist, he twisted one hand behind her back so hard she was sure it would snap, and lowered his mouth to her ear. You realize, of course, if you scream for help, you expose yourself as having snuck up to the bachelor's wing of your own volition. Driven, it would appear, by ambition and lust to the bedroom of a guest, a sullied end to a poor mountain girl's employment. Carrie groped with the fingers of the hand he'd pinioned behind her, digging her nails into the soft of his wrist. Grant's grip on her loosened only long enough for her to leap a few feet away and dive headlong for the knife, even as Grant dove to block the door. Snatching up the knife, she leapt for the far side of the room and flashed the blade now so that he could see. Ah, I suppose it should be no surprise that hillbilly trash would know how to put up a fight. He looked entertained, not in the least wary of her or her weapon. From the opposite side of the room, she braced for what she knew would be her one chance as he lunged at her. One sliver of a second to let fly the knife at a moving target. Then all at once he was coming for her, and she was drawing back her arm. Now came a pounding on the door that stopped them both in their tracks and turned them toward it. "Everything's all right in there, is it?" came a voice from the other side. Carrie spun back first and let the knife fly. A blood-curdling scream from Madison Grant. Jersey had been right. Sometimes, at least, she could gig a trout in the gills. Her eyes not leaving him, Carrie stepped swiftly to unlock the door. Moncrief, the footman, swung the door wide. "Bloody hell!" Carrie, her hair pulled wild and loose from the maid's cap that dangled by one hairpin, marched to the opposite side of the room. She yanked her knife from the wainscoting just a hair to the right of Madison Grant's thigh. He stood frozen in place, face drained of all color. "You have Moncrief here to thank," Carrie told Grant over her shoulder as she drew even with the footman. "It's only because he showed up when he did that I aimed." She glanced back one final time. To miss. Chapter 49. In the hours after they dragged his brother away, Sal faced what had to be done. Robert and Ella Bratchett had stepped forward from the crowd to volunteer to care for Nico for the night. Sal trusted them. But he'd also seen his brother's face, worse than an expression of horror. Instead, Nico's eyes had gone blank, insensible, just as he'd looked when Sal found him after the night of lynchings. Nico's mind had clearly moved to a place where he could not feel, could not hurt, could not panic. But also Sal knew he would not eat or speak. For Nico to survive, Sal would need to break out. LeBlanc caught him staring at the bars. "Plan to gnaw through those with your sharp little teeth, Guinea?" He turned to Wolf. "I'd watch that one if I were you." Wolf scowled. Like I ain't never learned my own job. Apparently you haven't. A murder months ago at your train station, and the killer's still at large, unless it's Catalfamo, in which case I did your job for you. In fact, I can't trust a fumbling backwater piker like you not to muff up a simple thing like keeping a watch on the Italian for the night. I'm staying here myself, Wolf, overnight, then transporting Catalfamo tomorrow back to New Orleans for trial. Thought you said he and the others already stood trial 4 years ago and got off. LeBlanc looked Sal up and down, then shrugged. Bringing him in's what I was hired to do. That's what I'm doing, 'cause some of us know how to do our jobs. What happens to him once I get him there isn't my concern. Wolf met the prisoner's eye, but addressed the detective over his shoulder. No, I don't reckon it would be. There would be no second trial, Sal knew. From the expression on the local lawman's face, Sal gathered Wolf knew it too. LeBlanc made a show of moving one of the jail's army cots near Sal's cell. Sullenly, Wolf served LeBlanc and himself slabs of salted venison and a clear liquid Wolf referred to only as home brew before shoving a tin cup at LeBlanc. So, little man, LeBlanc said to Wolf as they ate, time to show you how to do your job. Ramming a metal dinner tray under the metal flap at the foot of Sal's cell door, Wolf said nothing, but he stood there unmoving at the cell as Sal picked up the tray. Wolf's eyes dropped to the tray. Sal's followed. A tin cup of water sat there. A tin plate of venison, mostly gristle by the look of it. One metal spoon, no fork, no knife. Both of those presumably could be used as weapons. But under the upturned lip of the tin plate, 2 long, thin nails, one bent slightly at its point. Sal's eyes flew up to Wolf's, but met his only for an instant, Wolf already turning. Go the hell to sleep, Catalfamo, Wolf said. God knows you'll need it with the journey you've got ahead. Sal did not eat, but he made himself choke down the water, and made himself lie down on his cot and pull the rough wool blanket up to his chin, and lie there for hours. The nails might have been a trick, the setup for Wolf's plan to showcase a local lawman's savvy in catching a prisoner attempting escape, but it was Sal's only chance, so a chance worth taking, even if it earned him a bullet through the back. He waited until after moonlight flooded his cell. LeBlanc's snore rose and fell. Sal knew little of locks, though he'd picked one once years ago on a steamer trunk belonging to an Oxford don, staying at the Pensione in Florence. Sal had been quietly coached by the Pensione's old cook, who'd apparently led quite another life as a young woman. She'd murmured tips in his ear, where to hold the ice pick and the small paring knife she offered him from the kitchen. The professor, who'd lost his spectacles and his trunk keys on the first day, had tipped them both a half-crown. Now Sal worked the nails gently. He couldn't afford to clank them inside the lock. A half-hour passed as he prodded and poked with them, using the straight one as the tensioner, then gently pulling with the bent one. His back and shoulders tightened to the point of pain. Sweat poured from his face despite the chill of the brick floor and walls. Try after try after try. Nothing. Then finally, a lever sprang up. Tumblers shifted. Pocketing the nails, Sal slipped through the cell door, crept past the snoring LeBlanc. Glancing back toward where Wolf sat hunched, head down in his desk chair against a wall, Sal thought he saw the sheriff's head raised just an inch, but Sal didn't stay to be sure. He had no idea what direction to go to find Nico, only that Carrie McGregor once mentioned that the Bratchett's, the nearest neighbors to her own farm, helped care for her father. But Sal had only a general idea what direction Carrie walked in the evenings when she went home. North from the stables and up farther onto the ridge. Outside on the street, he dodged away from the street lamp's pool of gold light and into the shadows. Biltmore Estate would be where they'd look for him first, but also where he'd need to start to find the way to Nico. Chapter 50. In the vaulted room with the horse stalls, Lily stood still, listening, just inside the door that led to the stable's corridor near the tack room. Her voice echoed across the polished brick. "Were you looking for someone?" More footsteps sounded from the other side of the door, slow and deliberate. The door swung open, the man stepping inside. "Name's LeBlanc, but then you know very well who I am." A pause. "With the Pinkerton Detective Agency now." "Bien sûr. Yet you work also still for my father, non?" A pause. "Only he prefers going through Pinkerton now. Calls less attention." "Since when, Mr. LeBlanc, has my father wanted to call less attention to himself? It is a family failing. Your purpose here today, Mr. LeBlanc?" She'd play dumb if need be. "The dago your daddy sent me to find, and I damn well caught, broke out last night of the tin can these people here call a jail." Lily felt her heart rate drop, alarmingly. "A breakout, did you say? Mon Dieu! How very unfortunate for you. I know you've so hoped to appear at least marginally competent." Having just turned away, LeBlanc rounded on her. In the red of his face and the bulge of his eyes were the words, vulgar and raging, that he could not let himself say to the daughter of Maurice Barthélemy. "You know," she said, "my friend Emily, Mr. Vanderbilt's niece, told me of your visit at Christmas. Dago bastard. But I'll get him the hell back and make him pay for the trouble." Stepping to her right, Lily bumped the girth stretcher and sent it clattering to the floor. "Why, how clumsy of me. Is it in there with the stalls that you're wanting to go?" She fumbled with righting the stretcher. "Goodness, it's surprisingly heavy." She could hardly get the words of helplessness across her lips, but desperate times called for desperate measures, even if that meant feigning a weakness she'd never felt in her life. "Why, Mr. LeBlanc, I wonder if you could assist me." LeBlanc's voice softened slightly. "Glad to. Only where are the damn grooms who ought to be helping a lady?" "I'm sure there are some about, perhaps in the carriage house at the other end or cleaning the courtyard. But of course, as you point out, Mr. Vanderbilt has lost one of his stable hands to your hunt." She extended her hand to the detective's coat lapel and pulled him in closer, laid the palm of her free hand on his chest, saw his eyes go hungry on her, felt the swell of her own power. "Mr. LeBlanc, as one New Orleans native to another, let us be perfectly frank with each other. I have something to tell you." Chapter 51. Lily's pulse had dropped to only a distant flick, it felt like. No thud at all. Somewhere out there in the woods or fields, or in the alleyways of the village, was the man her father had evidently paid a detective to track for 4 years. But he couldn't have gotten far yet. LeBlanc would have looked here first, once the escape was discovered. This much was clear. The longer LeBlanc stayed here, the farther away Sal could run. If she'd learned anything from the example of the Napoleon of New Orleans, it was that some men could be made to do things they'd no intention of doing. Lily was sure her face had gone the pale of abalone, but this LeBlanc would not be able to see fear in her or hear it. Lily leaned in toward the detective. "Comme c'est triste." Her voice came out soft, seductive, steady. "Mr. LeBlanc, I have a confession to make." She lifted his hand to her waist, just under one breast. "I am telling you this only because I believe I can trust you, because I sense you know what it is to be swept away by passion." She looked deep into the man's bloodhound of a face, small, droopy eyes with jowls dropping well below his jawline. No man ever looked less likely to have been swept away by passion. His palm had gone clammy against her waist. "Lillian!" came a shout from the carriage house at the other end of the complex. "Lily, are you here?"
This is the end of disc number 9. Please insert disc number 10.